Now we're going to turn our focus to the investigation of Tuesday's attack. Fox News senior correspondent Rita Cosby joins us with the latest. Rita?
Tony, overnight authorities arrested a second man as a material witness in this case. The unidentified man was taken into custody in an apartment in Jersey City, New Jersey. And law enforcement sources tell Fox News he has information about the planning behind the two hijacked planes that struck the Twin Towers. The investigation is moving quickly with a second material witness arrested and the Justice Department promising a flurry of warrants to come soon. The first man arrested is the same one who was taken into custody Thursday night at JFK Airport after he presented a fake pilot's license to authorities. Law enforcement sources say he has ties to relatives of Osama bin Laden.
This becomes the last time any bin Laden family relations is attributed to the material witness pilot from JFK Airport, suspected of not only being a hijacker for the thwarted attempt of Flight 23, but the reattempts on September 13th at JFK Airport also.
I mean, this is a serious organization. If you could decapitate it by getting rid of Osama, you would make a start. And I believe if you could get rid of Saddam, you would make a huge start. When you cut through all the talk, I mean, there are a million governments and there are a lot of problems out there. But if you could get rid of, and I think we have to get rid of Osama. I don't care how difficult the terrain in Afghanistan is. I don't care whether it takes 200,000 ground troops. You cannot win this war on terrorism without getting rid of the man who, more than any other man, with a possible exception of Saddam, has organized it. And I think Osama and Saddam will be the focus of our efforts.
Well, no, I think the most important thing, while we move to get more information about what might happen in the future, the most important thing is to go back and look at some of these past terrorist incidents and see whether or not we believe there may have been state sponsorship and state involvement in the past. The Clinton administration at first took a look at the idea of Iraqi involvement in the World Trade Center bombing of 1993 and then veered away from it. We need to go back and look at that again closely, because if the Iraqi government was involved in the first World Trade Center attack 8 years ago, there's a chance that Saddam has been sitting over there perhaps with bin Laden and saying, hey, I got away with it the first time, maybe I'll try again.
The FBI confirms that a second man has been charged in this case as a material witness. The warrant was issued by a federal magistrate in New York. The FBI is being very tight-lipped about who the man is or what information they believe he could provide. They are still searching for 100 people for questioning in this case. Watch lists have been given to 18,000 police departments and circulated to airports around the country. They're to be matched against flight manifests in case any of these people try to fly either domestically or internationally.
Do you believe that anyone who participated in the events on Tuesday, or in fact even a support role, or on a plane that wasn't successfully hijacked, are they still at large in the United States?
We don't know. The possibility clearly exists that there could be additional terrorists out there that were part of this operation that maybe got cold feet and didn't get on the airplane, or for one reason or another were thwarted in their efforts. We have to assume that possibility exists. We had these 19 individuals in the United States, some of them for several years, training, preparing, getting ready for this operation. And we can by no means assume now that that's all there is. There may well be other operations that have been planned and are in fact in the works.
Do we have any evidence linking Saddam Hussein or Iraqis to this operation?
No.
Bob, the FBI is preparing to issue as many as 2 more additional material witness warrants this morning, bringing the total number of people in their custody who are believed to have direct knowledge of Tuesday's attack to 4. Additionally, the number of people for whom a red alert has gone out for questioning has now risen from 100 to 155. That list has been circulated to all the U.S. and foreign airline carriers, all the domestic police departments, as well as Customs, INS. And as for the 4 people who were named in the material witness warrant, it's not clear if they actually participated in planning the assaults, aborted their own attacks, or simply knew the individuals who were involved. They have not been charged with any crime as of this hour.
Let me ask you some questions about the ongoing investigation. You have 25 people that you have taken in for questioning. Do you think those people are participants in the plot? Will they be arrested?
Well, we're going to pursue leads. We've got some 40,000 tips that have been given to us over the internet, over 5,000 on the telephone. I'm not going to comment on each individual case or on individuals, but our effort is not just to find out who was involved in this plot, but our effort is to detect the scope and extent of the international terrorist networks that are in the United States and disrupt them and to make very difficult any reoccurrences.
Now, as you know, some critics are saying this is locking the barn door after the horse gets out. Why hasn't the FBI been all over these terrorist cells if we know they're here in the United States already?
Well, there is a terrorism effort in the United States and abroad, and a great deal has been done in recent times to disrupt the efforts of terrorists. Obviously, this particular terrorist attack was not disrupted, but others were.
There are some news reports that quote law enforcement officials saying that there were up to 30 other targets of this particular group of terrorists. Can you confirm that?
I'm not in a position to confirm that.
And that Atlanta was one of the targets.
I'm not in a position to confirm that.
Reluctant as Attorney General Ashcroft is to answer any specific questions, the circumstances regarding the question of Atlanta Airport is difficult to figure out on what happened there. But let us pause for a moment with deducting these reports to try to find out the true identity of our material witness from JFK Airport, suspected to have also been an attempted Flight 23 hijacker, amongst the other reports of apprehensions and few other material witnesses. But as far as Atlanta goes, interestingly, just the day before, Logan Airport being one of the last airports to reopen since all airports were shut since the attacks, aside Reagan National being further delayed, on September 15th, the first day Logan opened up, CNN reported this.
Just a sense of how jittery things are in the country. A man was taken off a Delta Airlines flight, Boston, that would be Boston Logan, and you see the significance there, to Atlanta for what's described as suspicious and rowdy behavior. The man was, quote, vaguely Arab looking, end quote. I don't have a clue what that means, to be honest, and kept changing seats in first class. It's very jittery there. It's very jittery, period.
And at Boston's Logan Airport tonight, a Delta flight bound for Atlanta returned to the gate and a passenger was taken into custody. Flight 1069 was ready to take off when the captain made an announcement saying there was a safety emergency. After returning to the gate, police stormed that plane and removed a man. Witnesses say he appeared to be of Middle Eastern descent. There is no information about why he was taken into custody.
This Delta flight that was about to depart Boston Logan with this unruly Middle Eastern man, with the destination being Atlanta, Georgia, you would think was an early sign enough for Atlanta being a 9/11 target, in reference to the question posed to John Ashcroft earlier. But in actuality, Associated Press picked up a report that was circulated through most of the networks on September 14th, the day before Logan reopened.
We have a news story we should report. Here it is. It's being handed to me. Associated Press, Dateline Washington. The FBI has information that Atlanta was a target of terrorists.
Jim Stewart, Jim, a question. Late in the day, Associated Press, quoting an FBI source, said that Atlanta had been a target, or perhaps still was a target, it was unclear, of terrorists. What do we know about that?
Dan, it's confusing. The AP is quoting law enforcement officials who say the FBI had this fear. The FBI has not responded to queries about this, but earlier in the day said that they had no knowledge of any other attacks beyond the 4 that were carried out Tuesday, and we'll continue to look into this for you.
Tonight, there is a report that Atlanta may have been a target at one point. Now, a lot of this stuff is going to begin to pop up in the next day or so, but what do we know about reliability of that?
We don't know whether it's reliable, Tom. We do know that in an interview with investigators, one person, apparently we're told, who has talked to the hijackers, thought that there might be other cities, that Atlanta might be among them, but there's simply no way to know whether that is true. It's totally unconfirmed at this point. No way to know what to make of it.
And Pete, yesterday they were talking about tracking down 40 so-called associates who may have had a role in these hijackings. They still on the trail of those people?
Well, yes, but that number, I think, has expanded more to 100.
The Associated Press quotes law enforcement officials as saying Atlanta may have been a target of terrorists.
A law enforcement official is telling Fox News that Atlanta was also an intended target for the terrorists. The official says that authorities determined that after interviewing several people close to the hijackers in recent days. Atlanta's airport is a major transportation hub and also could have been the target, but we're not sure of that.
Justice Department sources tell CNN an individual has been arrested as a material witness in the terrorist hijacking investigation. U.S. officials tell CNN there are still would-be terrorists inside the United States who may try to attack targets in the country. Some may be trained as pilots. And if that isn't scary enough, officials say there may be other types of threats as well. A well-placed security source tells CNN that Atlanta, Boston, and Richmond, Virginia also were terrorist targets. The only specifics given were tall buildings and sports facilities.
Jim, it's sort of popping out like pimples now. All kinds of reports of all kinds of targets of law enforcement officers and arrests, real and imagined. What do you know about all that?
Well, we know that there have been reports on the Associated Press and in other locations that Atlanta, Georgia may have been targeted. There are now reports in some circles that other cities may have been targeted as well. I have tracked that down as best that I can, and I am told unequivocally that the source of that information is dead wrong. It is, in the words of one official, baloney. Dan?
That includes the report about Atlanta being a target of the terrorists.
Yes, sir.
Also, some hours ago, the FBI warned 2 cities that they might have been targets in the terrorist plot. An acquaintance of one of the hijackers had said that Federal Reserve banks in Atlanta and Richmond, Virginia could be targets. But at the same time, he has failed a lie detector test, casting serious doubt on his credibility. Also, Boston's Logan Airport, one of the airports the hijackers departed from, is now set to reopen a few hours from now at 5:30 a.m. Eastern Time.
General Clark, there's been some talk about, wondering who the enemy is, and I saw some wire reports and some of our reporting talking about that there were worries now still that perhaps this isn't all over and done with, that they were worried about further terrorist attacks and maybe in different forms. And we've had the first arrest, I think you've known with the updates on news here that we've been telling you about one of the arrests of one of the people who was taken into custody, I believe, at one of the 2 New York airports on Thursday evening. I think it was JFK or LaGuardia. Those were, they took in like 10 or 12 people, and now they've had the first arrest.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you do to watch out, like Jeremiah says, for what could be coming in the next wave?
Well, you have to go back and go through a security analysis of all of your vulnerable systems. The airports, certainly, but also other things, our utilities, our public services. There's much more horrifying scenarios that could be constructed than what happened. And we need to make sure those scenarios never happen. So that's the first battle we're waging right now in the United States. Now, we don't know if we're winning or not, but we've got to do our best.
Well, I saw, too, the FBI was saying, although this person did not pass the lie detector test, so they're saying that perhaps this isn't accurate as they thought before, but there was a warning that maybe Boston, Atlanta, Richmond, Virginia might have also been targets during Tuesday's attacks. So now they wonder, because he didn't pass the lie detector test where they got some of this information, but they were talking about people are worried who work in skyscrapers. They're nervous about that, and that gun sales are up. Particularly, they're edgy in Boston, where the first 2 planes that hit the World Trade Center towers hit.
Well, I think it would be really surprising if he only had 4 teams, and 3 of the 4 teams took over and were successful, in this case, with these aircraft.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't know how many teams there really were and how many people are fleeing across the country trying to get away or waiting to try it in a different manner.
Mm-hmm. In regards to all the sites that were attacked, apparently not only the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and wherever that plane was headed in Pennsylvania, they've been trying to determine. They have identified that Air Force One and the White House were also targets, and now word that Atlanta, perhaps the nation's busiest airport, was the intended target of either one of those or another plane that was grounded and perhaps didn't have the chance to carry out its deadly mission.
That, according to an informant that spilled his guts and knew about this this whole plan to pretty much create terror in this country.
We can only imagine who the 9/11 hijacker acquaintance might be. But clearly, as we've been able to tell this far within the week's reporting of 9/11, set aside for what material witnesses we have yet to determine, there are still plenty of suspects being detained under immigration and naturalization laws. However, the detail of Fox News' Laura Dew added about Air Force One being a target on 9/11 is a report vaguely remembered but not obscure. However, some early reports to have attributed that claim also never made it clear whether the President and Air Force One was a target while in the air or stationed on the ground somewhere, like in Florida, before liftoff. But as what General Wesley Clark was pointing out about going back and analyzing our security systems, particularly at the airports, and to also get a better understanding with the circumstances of Delta Airlines at the time, here are some special reports within the first 2 days of 9/11 regarding even airports that were involved in the attacks.
Our security is very, very sloppy. And it's not because the systems aren't there, it's because we don't use them. People aren't security aware.
CBS News has learned the two airlines involved in yesterday's terrorist attack have been repeatedly cited for security violations. In the last 6 months of 2000, American Airlines was fined more than $400,000 for 49 incidents. United Airlines was fined $356,000 for 38 incidents. Delta was even worse, more than $600,000. In July, the FAA proposed fining American an additional $99,000 for security violations at several airports, including Boston's Logan Airport, where two of yesterday's doomed flights originated. After a series of security breaches at Los Angeles International Airport, a reporter from KCBS TV went undercover in 1999.
Is security so loose that it's possible for a terrorist to get a weapon on an airplane? We found out it's not only possible, in some cases, it's easy.
Security staff failed to properly check passengers. A producer posing as a traveler in a wheelchair was pushed around metal detectors and not adequately inspected.
When a security checker misses an encapsulated pistol or some other test, you fire them. You don't retrain them. This is security. It's my life and yours.
The agency charged with spearheading airport security and safeguarding the skies, the Federal Aviation Administration. Now, after the most devastating terrorist attack in U.S. history, the FAA, often criticized for lax enforcement and bureaucratic bungling, is itself under siege.
The FAA has blood on its hands because it's not doing its job and hasn't been.
Michael Boyd is an independent aviation consultant with commercial airlines among his clients.
We have a major security problem, obviously, and the FAA is at the middle of it. We've known this for years. I've said it for years, that to a trained terrorist, our airports look like a laundromat. You can get in and get out.
Along with each commercial airline disaster have come new revelations of serious failures by the FAA. Perhaps none more frightening than the multitude of security lapses. 1988, Lockerbie, Scotland. A terrorist bomb blows Pan Am Flight 103 out of the sky. The aftermath brought both recriminations and recommendations. Our government assured us airport security would be beefed up. Additional security personnel were hired, metal detectors, X-ray machines, and most recently, bomb detection technology. All were deployed to combat the threat of terrorism. But time and time again, in the 12 years since Lockerbie, gaping holes in security have been exposed. Holes the FAA pledged to fix. Holes that government reports warned still remained. Holes that were likely exploited by these terrorists today. There appears to have been a total breakdown at least 3 airports in this country. Give us the scenario of what might have happened.
Well, there are 2 plausible scenarios. Either someone was able to get through the security side at those airports, or maybe even more likely, people working on the ground crews had been compromised.
How easy is it, and tell us the plain truth, to get a gun or a bomb on an airplane?
There are always some airports that fail when we try to get a gun or a knife on an aircraft.
How easy is it to get a job as a security screener?
It is as easy as falling off the proverbial turnip truck to get a job as a security screener. We have people that would be flipping hamburgers if they weren't working in the security function. They're not very well skilled, there's very high turnover, and I'm not sure that they're up to the job.
But inadequate screening of passengers and baggage is not the only threat to security.
We don't screen the people who work at airports properly. At tests that have been done at airports around the United States, we found a large percentage of, or certainly a large number of illegal immigrants, people whose background that we really couldn't check out.
In fact, as Dateline reported in 1996, our producers applied for and were given jobs at 2 of the biggest airports in the country. At Newark Airport in New Jersey, where one of the hijacked planes departed this morning, our undercover producer was hired on the spot, no questions asked, and no job references checked to drive this electric car. But within 2 days, he was working security checking carry-on bags. He was given no training. And watch how our undercover producer wanders along tarmacs and throughout airplanes without the ID to be there. And he passes some 10 other airport employees without being stopped. At Hartsfield Airport in Atlanta, our producer was hired as a baggage handler without the required background check. Again, he was free to roam on airliners like this one. After Dateline's broadcast, the FAA did change policy to try to prevent these types of security breaches, but recent government reports indicate problems persist.
Obviously, from the news reports we've collected about JFK and LaGuardia Airport on the evening of September 13th, would imply even greater security vulnerabilities than these two recent news pieces elaborated on, as the method of operation with hijacking some of the 9/11 flights, where it may have been circumstances that hijackers posed as pilots and flight crew themselves, rather than them just receiving help from the passenger security screeners or airport employees stationary on the ground, boarding the flights as passengers. But again, with Atlanta as a possible target, on September 24, 2001, under a CNN headline, Box cutters found on other September 11th flights, regarding the FBI pursuing tips and potential leads on the criminal dragnet investigation, it states that a knowledgeable source said 2 small knives were found on a Delta flight that was supposed to depart Boston, and a box cutter was found on an Atlanta to Brussels Delta flight. These planes didn't take off since all flights were grounded after the hijackings. The tools were found when the planes were searched. Now, as far as Atlanta's Hartsfield Airport goes, and all the reports already coming in from September 14th and onward about Atlanta being a target, it would seem that either both the airport or any major landmark or financial institution in Atlanta was a threat there also, whether it was going to be a direct target coming from Hartsfield. But as mentioned with the newspaper report, Hartsfield, Atlanta is not only the second busiest airport on the East Coast, it's also where Delta Airlines flights are more prominent to any other U.S. carriers due to Delta's corporate offices being stationed in Atlanta. But if we go back and try to figure out the incident with Delta Flight 1069 at Boston Logan from September 15th, a day after it reopened, according to 9/11 documents released on the government archive site, Crisis Hijacked Aircraft W90055 miscellaneous, that's mostly redacted, seems to show charted news and emergency reports on 9/11 and the following days up until September 16th. And on Saturday, September 15, it says, at 10:18 a.m., Boston questionable passenger on Delta 1069, paid ticket with cash, moved to several different seats, suspect removed from aircraft, luggage removed also, suspect cleared by Mass SP, which likely stands for Massport. And it also says at 11:40 a.m., Boston TWA 192 on the ground with questionable suspect on board, aircraft met with Massport and FBI. But on page 21, looking into the sections of the official 9/11 flights, it states a Delta flight with no number or name, only that it was departing Boston to LAX. 1239 reports that a Middle Eastern woman and baby would be aboard the flight with a bomb on their person. Reports received info from an ATCT via LAX PD, which would mean police department. Notified of non-specific bomb threat at 2147 local time, which would mean 9:47 p.m. Besides that, this document also charts reported activity relating to Flight 23 at JFK Airport, detailing that the 3 suspects had fled, as well as the other reports 2 days after at JFK and LaGuardia. But going back again referring to Delta flights at Boston Logan, there is also a much more popular case that's been overlooked but on 9/11, which is also detailed in the document categorically. As most viewers are already familiar with these scenes from Jason Burmis and Dylan Avery's internet blockbuster Loose Change 2nd Edition in regards to the official United Airlines Flight 93 that departed Newark Airport, added with the theory that there was another plane or duplicate that it was shot down over Shanksville, rather than it being Flight 93 having crashed.
So if Flight 93 didn't go down in Shanksville, then where? You ready for this? Cleveland. At 11:43 on September 11th, WCPO, a local TV station in Cincinnati, Ohio, reported that 2 planes landed at Cleveland Hopkins Airport due to a bomb threat. United Airlines identified one of the planes as Flight 93. Are you confused? Well, it gets better. Check it out. At approximately 10 a.m., Cleveland Hopkins Airport was evacuated amidst rumors that a hijacked plane was going to land. Passengers had to leave, but couldn't drive. They had to walk or hitchhike. Buses weren't allowed to leave. People were sent home. According to Associated Press and local Ohio papers, 1 plane landed at approximately 10:45. but Delta Airlines confirmed that their plane, Delta 1989, landed in Cleveland at 10:10. Therefore, Flight 93 landed at Cleveland at approximately 10:45. Authorities searched Delta 1989 for over 2 hours, and passengers were questioned individually. The plane dealer reported that the plane was evacuated at 12:30. But the Akron Beacon reports that a plane was evacuated at 11:15, which would make that Flight 93. Mayor White reported that the plane had 200 passengers. But a passenger from Delta 1989 described 60 or so passengers. So at 11:15, 200 or so passengers were released from Flight 93. The passenger from Delta 1989 states that she was taken into FAA headquarters. But other reports say that passengers were brought into the NASA Glenn Research Center, located near the west end of the airport, which had already been evacuated. So, to sum up, Delta 1989 landed at 10:10, was evacuated at 12:30, almost 2.5 hours later, and 69 passengers were taken to FAA headquarters. Flight 93 landed at 10:45 and evacuated within a half hour. 200 or so passengers quickly taken to an empty NASA research center. Why did it take 140 minutes to evacuate 69 passengers when 200 were evacuated in a half hour? We can assume that the passengers from Delta 1989 are safe somewhere. The question remains, what happened to the 200 or so passengers from Flight 93? It's interesting to note that the combined total of all the passengers from all 4 flights is 198, or 243, depending on who you ask.
Well, we can do more than just assume Delta 1989 passengers are safe, and we can also provide an answer to Loose Change's mind-boggling question as to why it took over 2 hours to evacuate the plane, as well as the mix-up of 2 hijacked planes landing at Cleveland, and the insinuation that one of them was Flight 93 with 200 passengers, in this vivid assertion to equate the maximum load of passengers as being from within all 4 9/11 hijacked flights, evacuated into a NASA center at Cleveland Airport in an absurd plane swap theory in which other opportunists have crafted in their own competitive disinformation. But with the Loose Change saga still promoting this outlandish narrative as it still being half of Jason Bermas's endeavor, all Bermas had to simply do to avoid this mistake was to acknowledge all of History Channel's Grounded on 9/11.
By 9:20, with close to 4,500 flights still over or approaching North America, 2 planes over Cleveland Center are not responding to controller calls. Delta 1989 and United 93 will be listed as the 4th and 5th hijackings of the day unless controllers can re-establish communication.
Cleveland Center had several aircraft with which they did not have contact, whether they were in the middle of a frequency change, whether they were aircraft that weren't responding to calls, but at one point or another, there were several aircraft airborne that nobody was certain about.
When a pilot crosses from one controller's sector into another, he must switch to the next controller's frequency. During the process, it's not uncommon for dropouts to occur, briefly rendering the plane's radio silent. But on 9/11, dropouts on the 2 planes above Cleveland Center have far more sinister implications. At about 35,000 feet, United 93 and Delta 1989 cross paths. As United 93's radar signal momentarily blinks off, controllers hear someone scream on an errant frequency. But because the caller did not repeat or include a flight ID number, controllers cannot confirm from which plane the call is made.
There was confusion in watching the screen. Those planes crossed, and they lost sight of exactly which plane was which. So they had a tremendous number of challenges.
As the FAA and law enforcement started trying to profile, for lack of a better word, the types of aircraft that were involved, heavy jet departures from the East Coast, West Coast destinations, Cleveland Center had stewardship of several of those types of airplanes, including a Delta flight that they immediately suspected might be another potential hijack target.
Besides the planes that hit the towers, Delta 1989 is the only other 767 direct from Boston to LA, departing at 8 a.m. Following the unconfirmed distress call to Cleveland Center, the Delta pilot reports an unruly passenger to his company dispatchers. Suspicions of a hijacking are raised further when he requests an unscheduled landing at Cleveland Airport.
FBI and Cleveland SWAT bring in their heaviest equipment to confront any hijackers.
With the events going on throughout the country, obviously we knew we were under attack. What goes through your mind? At that time, things were happening so quickly, we just had to be focused on the mission we were given to come out to Cleveland Hopkins International Airport to handle a hijacked aircraft.
As you can see, one might be inclined to come to a better understanding why travelers were not allowed to be mobile in fleeing Cleveland Hopkins Airport. But just as minimal as History Channel's Grounded on 9/11 was in detailing the events that took place on Flight 23 at JFK Airport, it would be logical to conclude the same with unruly passengers on Delta Flight 1989, since in other reports like the Boston Herald, September 19, 2001, under the headline, War on Terrorism, 2 more planes possibly targeted on Day of Terror by Doug Hanchett and Cosmo Macera Jr. states that sources say at least 1 female passenger reported suspicious behavior by 2 male passengers. Sources say the woman told federal agents that 2 men appeared nervous as the flight sat on Logan's runway awaiting takeoff. She also said they repeatedly looked around the cabin and were restless early in the flight, as if they were looking for others but couldn't find them. But in a much more obscure article from the Massachusetts Wareham Courier on September 20th, 2001, written by Ruth Thompson, who interviewed a female passenger, Mary McFadden, documenting her story with her family who were originally planning to be on the doomed American Airlines Flight 11 that struck the North Tower, but at last minute she changed her family's flight to Delta 1989 for a lower fee. McFadden said in hindsight there were irregularities during her flight that may or may not have had a connection to the terrorism taking place on other planes. There was one man on our plane who would not get off his cell phone, she said. He was speaking in a low, urgent voice. Even when the stewardess went over to him to tell him to turn off the phone, he wouldn't. That's very odd. She also spoke of another passenger who said a man in the seat next to her spooked her because he kept turning his head and looking around throughout the entire flight. It was as though he was waiting for someone, McFadden said. Maybe they were going to hit our plane but the others didn't show up. I don't know. You think of things. While in flight, McFadden said they were not aware of anything unusual taking place in the world outside of their cabin. But then when we had to make an emergency landing, we were told there may be a bomb on the plane or it might be getting hijacked. But I gotta say, even with the advantage of these newspaper articles laid out, and just relying on History Channel's Grounded on 9/11, the truth of the matter with the incident of Delta 1989 is very telling of Jason Burmis and Dylan Avery's intentions, being that no correction or retraction regarding their bogus claim of Flight 93 landing in Cleveland Hopkins being a mix-up of Delta 1989's flight path near the confirmed dangers of Flight 93, there is no effort put out by them in apologizing or publicly revising, while Avery has continued his loose change saga without Burmis. But yet Burmis going solo with Fabled Enemies, he did not take the opportunity to at least add Delta 1989 with Flight 23 at JFK Airport to see for himself that there was something bigger going on September 11th, and more than likely, Burmis did not care to correct Avery in his newer versions of Loose Change. Basically, Burmis by himself omitting this additional incident with Delta 1989 from Grounded on 9/11 is cherry-picking, therefore absolutely dishonest and disingenuous. But as far as Boston Logan Airport goes, Delta 1989 isn't the only additional suspected flight. According to BBC News on September 18th, an article titled FBI Probes Attempted Fifth Hijack, the phrase that was used more than just being attributed to Flight 23 at JFK Airport, the article states that another suspected American Airlines plane out of Boston Logan, Flight 43, was an additional target. That the FBI were searching for a number of passengers who were due to fly on American Airlines Flight 43 from Boston, which was grounded due to a mechanical problem. It was scheduled at 8:10 a.m., departure from Boston. So now we're looking at the potential that there were 4 intended hijackings from Boston Logan. However, in the Daily Telegraph on September 20th, in an article titled, More Planes May Have Been Targeted, FBI, up to 5 other flights on September 11th regarded by FBI as suspicious, that another United Airlines flight out of Logan, destined for San Francisco, was suspected by the FBI as a potential target for hijacking, but according to one of the passengers, Janice Burnett, that it may have been spared due to the fact that there were 30 U.S. Marines traveling on it, and that those guys were pretty visible in the boarding area, big and muscular, with their trademark haircuts and duffel bags. And also in the same Boston Herald article mentioned earlier regarding Delta 1989 from September 19th, meanwhile, a group of Boston area tourists headed to San Francisco on United Airlines Flight 163 earlier that fateful morning said that they were informed by airport security personnel in Iowa that their plane may have also been eyed by terrorists. "They told us we were targeted," said passenger Ruth Vana of Malden. That's how they worded it. According to Janice Burnett, a tour guide with Milford-based Scout Tours who was on the flight, security workers at the Des Moines airport, where the plane was forced to land, told passengers that the FBI discovered information on their flight in a car believed to belong to the terrorists. The car, a rental that was left at Logan, was towed away and impounded by the FBI last week. With these revelations in mind, we are looking at the basic scope that ultimately there could have been 5 intended hijack targets of flights at Boston Logan, included with the 2 successful hijackings that struck the Twin Towers. And with one of those flights having not departed, and possibly other operatives having either backed out of the plan or possibly running into complications to carry out their missions, you have to ask yourself, what happened to the other suspects from these additional Logan flights? As you might notice with reports after September 11th, there was a clue looming that authorities thought that some of the 9/11 hijackers had unauthorized, unrestricted access of Boston Logan Airport. And as we know now, there has been a tremendous problem as far as chain of evidence goes, providing that all 10 hijackers boarded flights 11 and 175 as passengers. And although there are countless anomalies and investigative details alluding to cover-up regarding Mohammed Atta and Abdulaziz Al-Omari, as well as the other alleged 8 hijackers of flights 11 and 175 at Logan, which we don't have time to make this film a focus on, as the circumstances regarding them is a subject big enough as a different film within the official scope. But unlike Jetport, Maine, where the security CCTV stop-still video confirmed that Atta and Al-Omari boarded their connecting flight to Boston Logan, you can see now as to why authorities have not released any of the security CCTV video from Logan Airport that was seized by the FBI in the immediate dragnet investigation. Because if the truth be told, then we're actually dealing with a situation where potentially 5 airliners were targeted for hijacking out of Logan. You can imagine that there certainly would have been many Middle Eastern suspects throughout the airport and departure lounges, possibly interacting with different hijacking team members, or even some of the hijackers themselves on flights 11 and 175 were not totally identified. But this realization so far, inferring a wider scale of attacks just from coming out of Boston Logan alone, should bring to question as to what targets were the other 3 airliners intended for, if the hijackings had succeeded in becoming operational separate from flights 11 and 175, other than the city of Boston being a potential target, considering that all these possibly targeted flights were all continental routes to arrive in California, as were all 4 official 9/11 flights. There were still other worthy landmark targets in New York, like the Empire State and UN buildings, and possibly again to strike the Twin Towers while they were still standing. But in an attempt to possibly reveal where these extra potential Logan hijackers may have fled and come from originally, there is also the question regarding as to why hijackers Atta and Al-Omari went on an unusual route of travel the day before on September 10th, clearly going out of the way all the way up to Portland, Maine, where they depart the next morning on a charter flight from Jetport to allegedly connect to Flight 11 at Boston Logan, becoming the first plane that crashes into the Twin Towers. When according to the official story, Atta and Al-Omari were already in Boston on September 10th, where they had rented a second rental car. However, before we address that, there are a couple of things that need to be looked at.
Meanwhile, investigators here seem to have collected all the evidence that they want to from this airport. We've been told that they took some seats from some terminals to test them for DNA. Also, as we told you yesterday, there was a car that was impounded from one of the parking lots here at Logan that was connected with the hijackers. And in that car, we told you, were flight manuals in Arabic. We're also now learning from law enforcement sources that there was a ramp pass in that car, a little employee badge that allows people into secure areas of Logan Airport. So this is something that raises some questions about security here at Logan.
The Boston Globe, in its morning editions, is running a piece that says that 2 of the alleged hijackers who left out of Boston had what is known in the airline business as a ramp pass, or can be known as a tarmac pass, that allows either vehicles or individuals access out to where the planes taxi, take off, arrive, park, catering, cleaning, maintenance, all of that. That would certainly help anyone hell-bent on doing any harm to an aircraft.
Aside what suspicious items were first reported to have been found in the white rental car left at Logan, copies of the Quran, flight training manuals, and letters and instructions written in Arabic, flight uniforms, and Logan ramp passes were also discovered, which would have indicated that some of the hijackers had the ability of gaining unrestricted access of Logan Airport. All these additional items would seem to disappear, as they are not part of the official story or contained within the Zacharias Moussaoui trial evidence exhibits. And aside for those additional items being omitted, Atta's transaction on the rental cars, with one being left at Logan, was discovered by authorities on the day of 9/11 by an early tip from a traveler who saw Middle Eastern men get into an altercation near the vehicle.
As rescuers toil, another high-stakes effort is underway to find those responsible for the carnage. NBC's Chris Hansen reports investigators are making swift progress.
Authorities may have identified some of the actual hijackers, and here's how they think they might have done that. Yesterday, they got a phone call from a passenger who had left Logan and arrived at his destination. Of course, he saw on the television monitors what had happened at the World Trade Center. He called investigators to say that he had had an altercation with two men he described as being Arabic in the central parking garage near the American Airlines terminal here at Boston Logan. He described the car that they were near, which was turned out to be a rental car, a Mitsubishi sedan. Investigators arrived at the sedan, took a quick look, and they found inside that there were flight training manuals in Arabic. They were able to connect that sedan to two men who are now identified as brothers, both of whom have passports from the United Arab Emirates, one of whom is a trained pilot.
All of it subsequently put the 9/11 dragnet on the trail, with Boston police raiding downtown hotels the next day on September 12th, primarily at the Westin Comply Inn. It was reported that 3 people were detained, 2 of them being female, with numerous suspicious items, such as hair dye, and that the rooms they rented were linked to the same credit card used to rent the white car at Logan. Plus, the bomb squad was also called out. Reports indicated that the 3 suspects were not arrested, but no clarity was brought if they were still detained for INS charges. However, Boston's WBZ4 Beth Germano, extensively covering what was going on at Logan, she also reported this detail about the suspects detained from Westin Comply.
And when heavily armed agents entered the Westin Hotel yesterday, it was because of a trail of credit card receipts that may again be linked to hijackers. When the FBI and Massachusetts State Police surrounded a Chestnut Hill motel yesterday, they were looking for more evidence that terrorists may have stayed here. At least 3 people were detained in Boston and later released, though the Attorney General says there's no way of knowing yet how many associates remain at large. WBZ News has now learned that the 3 individuals questioned by police in Boston yesterday and released were taken into custody because they had the same last name as Mohammed Atta, the man who has reportedly emerged as a prime suspect.
Police had also searched a Best Western outside of Boston. However, this motel actually became an official place where some of the 9/11 hijackers had stayed. And in the interest of this film not to focus so much on the official flights, although there is still a lot of problems regarding the hijacking roster, and the phone calls from the flights indicating weapons used that is contrary to the official version, as well as not a complete chain of evidence with no CCTV video released from Logan, all of which being issues to address into a different film, it is still worth revisiting what the unneeded route of travel to Portland, Maine the day before, on 9/10, to bring some perspective as to additional and unaccounted for conspirators. As I've also covered in a short film called Why Did Mohammed Atta Go to Portland, Maine, 9/10 hour to 9/11, bringing the question as to why this unusual route of travel. I covered these news reports the following days after 9/11 that were often detailed along with the Boston hotel raids.
Yesterday, the police chief in Portland, Maine has told us that 5 men came across the border in Jackman, Maine.
Sources telling CNN that 2 of the hijackers apparently crossed from Nova Scotia, Canada by ferry to the port of Bar Harbor in the state of Maine.
Authorities telling the CBC today that they're working in Jackman, Maine, which is a small border crossing between Nova Scotia and Maine, and also at the Yarmouth area, and they've requested the manifests of the ferry that runs from Yarmouth to Portland, Maine.
Peter, there are few comments, no details. All Canadian authorities will say is yes, they are investigating. In Halifax, a car meticulously stripped and dusted. But the RCMP will not discuss the search for a Canadian connection.
And another rental car belonging to other suspects was found at a jet port in Portland, Maine. And that car may be the key to all the speculation about a Canadian connection.
Also today, authorities were tracking another set of 6 hijackers who
who were believed to have entered the country from Canada at a small border crossing in Jackman, Maine. The men are then believed to have flown into Boston on commuter flights yesterday morning.
Basically, with all the indications of these reports, Atta and Alamari must have at some point rendezvoused with other operatives who that came in from the Canadian border by way of Jackman, Maine, and to Nova Scotia by ferry into Bar Harbor, where there was also another rental car authorities there in Canada were searching at the Halifax airport. Also additionally mentioned in one of the reports,
yesterday, the police chief in Portland, Maine has told us that 5 men came across the border in Jackman, Maine. They all tried to board a commuter flight out of Bangor, but there was only room for 3 of them. The 2 others went on to Portland. They reportedly boarded a U.S. air commuter at 5:53 yesterday morning to make the connection in Boston. We're not clear whether it was the connection to the American flight or the United flight, but it's clear that they came in from Canada just before this flight.
In the Associated Press, written by David Sharp on September 13th, it states not only did the FBI also sought passenger manifests from 2 ferries that travel between Nova Scotia and Maine, the Scotia Prince in Portland and the Cat in Bar Harbor, but it also speaks of the FBI focusing its attention on a cell phone company in Bangor, where agents interviewed employees at Unicel's corporate office on Union Street next to the Bangor airport. The vice president of Unicel stated that the FBI agents were interested in knowing more about several men who attempted to buy cell phones recently. In a New York Times article titled, "After the Attacks, the Hijackers, FBI Traces Path of 5 in New England from September 13, 2001, written by James C. McKinley Jr. and Kate Zernick, it states, federal agents questioned employees at a store in Bangor where 5 men believed to be the hijackers tried to rent or buy cell phones late last week. When the employees refused to sell the phones because the men lacked proper identification and were not Maine residents, the men displayed a large amount of cash, but the employees did not accept an offer from the men to buy phones for $3,000. The men then phoned the Bangor airport trying to get a flight to Boston but were told there was no flight that matched their desired departure time, the authorities said. The men then phoned Portland International Jetport, where 2 of them apparently made reservations for a flight to Boston on Tuesday morning. But of course none of this is confirmation that Atta and Alamari drove the rental car all the way up to Bangor, Maine on September 10th, as if they had potentially met up with additional hijacking operatives having crossed over from Canada in either direction. And it's also hard to determine if they were accompanied by anyone else additionally while in Portland, considering the limited security video that's been released of them at a bank teller and shopping in stores. But considering what those early Associated Press and New York Times articles stated about crossing over from Canada and 5 Arab men trying to buy cell phones in Bangor, Maine within the week prior to 9/11, according to Bangor Daily News on October 13, 2001 by Doug Kesley, in an article, Question of Bangor Link to Attacks Unanswered, that 3 area taxicab drivers say they provided rides to people they believed to be hijackers 10 days before the attacks. A cab driver named Laura Monteith said she picked up 3 men at about 12:45 a.m. outside Jimmy V's, a Bangor bar and restaurant. She says she can't forget the face or words of the man who sat in the front seat with her. Shown separate pictures of the hijackers, she identified Mohammed Atta. She also identified one of them as Flight 175 hijacker Fayaz Ban Hamad. Monteith also said that the 3rd passenger in the back didn't have the Middle Eastern appearance of the other 2. She said he was tall and lanky with blonde hair and glasses and was wearing tan dress slacks, a tan shirt, and a thin brown jacket. Another cab driver, Tom Sullivan, said that the day before the terrorist attacks, he took several men resembling the terrorists to Staples at the airport mall in Bangor and later dropped them off at the Bangor Mall. And a 3rd cab driver, who did not want to be identified, said that on Saturday, September 8th, he brought 4 men he now believes were among the terrorists to Ames department store at the airport mall. He said that they were in a rush to make a 4:30 p.m. flight and quickly bought 7 or 8 suitcases. But separate from these subjects, with the known hijackers Atta, Alamari, and Ben Hamad, previous to 9/11, these circumstances regarding operatives crossing over Canadian border and Bangor Airport was also picked up by Robert Russo of the Canadian Press in the headline titled, FBI Searches for Canadian Link, where it mentions that former chief of counterintelligence for the CIA, Vincent Canestraro, told the Montreal Gazette that U.S. investigators knew that 5 men recently entered Maine from Canada via ferry boats from Yarmouth and or remote border near Jackman, and also confirming 3 of them from Bangor Airport boarded a feeder plane, but only 3 of them could get on board because it was full, and the other 2 went on to Portland and got a flight from Portland, which could likely mean several possible scenarios for the additional potential hijackers unable to depart from Bangor Airport, since it clearly states 5 of them came over from Canada, and it's known that Atta and Alamari both drove up to Maine from Boston in a rental car and would have likely already had the reservations set at Jetport. These extra operatives from Bangor could have took an earlier flight from Jetport, Maine, before Atta and Alamari took theirs the next morning after 5:45 a.m., or possibly another charter flight around the same time that morning as them, as well as the possibility they could have simply joined them on U.S. Airway Colgan commuter flight 5930, as I pointed out on the National Geographic's 910 The Final Hour, which also shows a copy of Flight 5930's manifest where 4 of the names are blurred out. But moving on to another official airport involved in the 9/11 attacks, as I've already examined the preceding Pentagon attack with the departure of American Airlines Flight 77 and the hijackers at Dulles Airport in another film of mine called 6 on 77, the Dulles Airport 9/11 cover-up, where I uncovered that there was actually a minimum of 6 operatives who hijacked Flight 77, rather than what the official story purports, claiming that there was only 5 hijackers, by the way of unveiling the mistake made in the initial release of the Dulles Security CCTV video with an additional Middle Eastern suspect first thought to be hijacker Hani Hanjour, subsequently before the release of the 9/11 Commission report in 2004, which had stated that a stewardess on board the doomed flight, Renee May, counted 6 hijackers through her phone call conversation on the flight. That circumstance with the FBI and 9/11 Commission reports investigations on Dulles Airport and Flight 77 gives us some validity to speculate inaccuracies and cover-ups about American Airlines Flight 77's official flight roster, as well as the weapons that were actually used, since in what I had also pointed out in the film, that Barbara Olson's phone call was picked up by an AT&T operator who had stated Olson said the hijackers had taken over the plane with knives and a gun, contrary to the loose interpretation of plastic-type knives detailed by her husband, Solicitor General Ted Olson, that then suddenly morphed into an absurd claim of box cutters. This is also a tremendously important detail because Flight 77 is the only 9/11 flight, interpreted by passengers, to have been taken over by box cutters. And one of the other features of the film 6 on 77, the Dulles Airport 9/11 cover-up, is demonstrating the situation of passenger screener company Argenbright Security with a Pakistani employee named Eric Gill, where on September 10th, the day before 9/11, he had a rude encounter with 5 Middle Eastern suspects at the West Checkpoint exit where he was stationed, with 3 of them being dressed in American Airlines ground worker uniforms, as they were having troubles gaining access, attempting to go into unrestricted areas of the airport that actually lead onto the concourse of where airliners are parked, potentially as a way of gaining access to pre-plant weapons on board Flight 77 and other flights. A story that was featured in the mini-documentary Unsafe at Any Altitude, briefly based on the underrated book with the same title by authors Joe and Susan P. Trento, which makes an example out of Dulles Airport with Eric Gill's story, that the real security vulnerability problem which made the 9/11 attacks succeed was the internal security inside the airport for the employees, not the security screening companies for the passengers, like Argenbright, therefore making the ultimate revelation that the federalizing of passenger security with the TSA was not the actual problem or solution in preventing further hijackings, that the private passenger screening companies were doing their job. Argenbright employee Eric Gill did identify 3 of the Middle Eastern men as 9/11 hijackers entering a restricted area of Dulles, but there's another problem with that. One of the hijackers Gill confirmed was Nawaf al-Hazmi, who does board and hijack Flight 77 there from Dulles the next day. But the other 2 were Marwan al-Shehi and Fayez Ben Hamad, who's supposed to be at Logan Airport in Boston, Massachusetts the following day, to board, hijack, as well as pilot United Airlines Flight 175. This becomes almost like another situation with Mohammed Atta and Abdulaziz al-Amari, as it seems to be another unnecessary route of travel the day before the attacks. But unlike Atta and al-Amari, this situation with al-Shehi and Ben Hamad is not part of the official story. Plus, as we just showed earlier with reports on the police and FBI dragnet scouring Boston, Massachusetts hotels and motels, where the hijackers and other unaccounted-for conspirators stayed at, there is no news coverage or reporting of investigators on the scene at Milner Hotel, which is what the official story says, as to where Marwan and the 3 other hijackers shared a room and stayed at in Boston. Essentially, if Eric Gill's story is true in regards of what happened at Dulles the day before, with the presence of Marwan and Fayez, may also play as an inaccurate flight rosters regarding Flights 11 and 175 at Logan. However, incidentally regarding Flight 77 on September 10th, the day before the attacks as well, it was on its routine route in which the American Airlines plane was actually at LAX Airport in California before departing back to Dulles Airport in Virginia. But what's now known about the route the day before comes from a WikiLeaks dump that was picked up by the Telegraph on September 1st, 2011, titled "The 9/11 Gang That Got Away," where supposedly 3 men from Qatar were supposed to fly in on Flight 77 to Dulles on 9/10, but ironically got cold feet and backed out of the operation, fleeing back to Qatar on a British Airways flight from LAX. They had only been in the country for 3 weeks posing as tourists. They allegedly carried out surveillance of the World Trade Center, the White House, the Pentagon, and CIA headquarters in Virginia. 10 days later, they flew to Los Angeles, where they stationed themselves in a hotel near the LAX, which the FBI established was paid for by a convicted terrorist, who also paid for their airline tickets. Hotel staff told investigators they saw pilot uniforms in the Qatari men's room, along with computer printouts detailing pilots' names, flight numbers, and times, and packages addressed to Syria, Afghanistan, Jordan, and Jerusalem. It would be very hard to determine what ultimately their plans or flight designations were, or if they were supposed to accompany the Flight 77 hijackers on 9/11, or possibly even target another nearby airport. But that would also be limiting the scope pertaining to Dulles, considering when referring back to the Daily Telegraph article from September 20th, 2001, more planes to have been targeted, FBI, up to 5 other flights on September 11th regarded by FBI as suspicious, where it also says, a United plane due to fly from Washington to the West Coast was also a possible target. It was canceled at short notice, and the FBI is investigating a report that 5 men of Arab appearance left hurriedly. No flight number is provided, but with so much going on and covered up as we've demonstrated with the other airports so far, including the roster of hijackers on Flight 77, it is highly doubtful these were just regular Middle Eastern passengers. But again with the Qatari 3, it is possible they may have been designated by themselves to target that flight, or one at Reagan National Airport, which is closest to DC, or Baltimore-Washington International Airport. And instead of following up on official airports with Newark, let us go further south than what we have already addressed with Atlanta, since it would be foolish not to consider any Florida targets, with most of the 19 hijackers having lived and gone to flight school there. As you may recall, after the fiasco with JFK and LaGuardia airports breaking out over the arrest of over a dozen suspects, there was an ABC News report on the early morning of September 14th at 1:28 a.m. with Ted Koppel and Pierre Thomas reporting on activity going on in Miami.
Yes, Peter, just to give you an example of how sweeping the investigation is unfolding across the country, sources are telling us that in Miami today, federal authorities have detained 4 additional people. Now, we're being told that 3 women and 1 man were detained in Miami. Their backgrounds are being investigated. And here's the reason why they were very suspicious of these people. Apparently at Miami International Airport, a woman went into a facility, changed clothes into flight attendant wear. A man who was in the vicinity began to run. Officials detained the man. Also, along with the woman, there were 2 other women who were wearing flight attendant wear as well. All 4 of these people have been detained. They're being questioned tonight. The suspicion is they might have ties, might be supporting some of these earlier attacks. Again, it's still unfolding. It may not turn out to be a connection, but the authorities are investigating, Ted.
The story was only picked up twice again on ABC just a couple of hours later by Darren McGinty, with a slight difference in details.
That 3 men and a woman were detained in Miami last night, and sources say suspicions were raised when one of the women changed into a flight attendant's uniform and the man ran from the scene.
Of course, McGinty's report, being that there were 3 men and 1 woman, sounds more plausible. But then again, here we are with the repeated detail of a woman being involved, as was reported between JFK and LaGuardia, as well as within the raid in Boston hotels the next day on September 12th. 5 hours later on CNN, Kelly Arena had picked up the story after being the first news source naming off 18 hijacker names from the 4 official 9/11 flights, as well as the update with the majority of the JFK and LaGuardia detainees being freed.
We also know that in Miami's airport, sources say that law enforcement detained several people there. One woman was seen walking into the airport in civilian clothing, went into the restroom, came out in a flight attendant uniform. She was with a man who also had a flight attendant uniform. When they were approached by authorities, they ran, but they were captured and they are now being questioned. And we also know that the U.S. Coast Guard has boarded a Carnival Cruise Line ship off the coast of Miami earlier today. They detained 2 people who authorities describe as having a history of hijacking. According to law enforcement sources, that ship was boarded at 3 a.m. after the passenger list was checked by authorities. So this manhunt continues, Leon, around the country.
And yes, according to what Kelly Arena said, authorities arrested suspects off this Carnival cruise ship in Miami. And none of this should be a surprise, although some reports could be just cases of false alarms, as there was also a bomb threat at the Orlando airport to consider.
A bomb threat at the Orlando airport turned out to be nothing, but no one was taking chances. The jitters are obvious not only at the airports, but among Americans just contemplating air travel.
And as we shown earlier with the morning of 9/11, Bush having attended an elementary school in Sarasota, and like it or not, it was also reported that the Secret Service had good intel that Air Force One was a target. But as a scenario with the port of entry from the north, like the possible suspects coming into the U.S. from Canada onto Maine, rendezvousing with official 9/11 hijackers, could there likely have been other suspects entering the country from the south, even the coastline to become operational in Florida? Quite possibly. As with the Qatari trio, there seems to be another trio with Afghani operatives having been staked out and preparing days before 9/11 off the Cayman Islands.
The one thing that the FBI has been able to stitch together is at least 7 of the pilots on their list of 19, the suicide pilots, were actually trained in Florida. And now there are questions. Were there any sort of warning signs that this was going to happen? There are details emerging tonight from the Cayman Islands.
Line has learned that U.S. government officials are now in the Cayman Islands investigating a letter delivered to a radio station there on August 29th, 12 days before the hijackings. The anonymous letter writer said he was convinced that 3 Afghanis who'd entered the island illegally were agents of Osama bin Laden, and he warned that they, quote, are organizing a major terrorist act against the U.S. via an airline or airlines. He asked a radio station talk show host to pass that information to the authorities and, quote, refrain from being naive and complacent in this serious situation. A radio station manager forwarded the letter to a Cayman government official on September 6th, but according to a government statement, treated it as, quote, merely speculation on the part of the author. The government goes on to say the writer has now been interviewed and has stated that indeed the letter was purely speculation on his part. Dateline has been unable to reach the author. The 3 men the letter writer said were agents of Osama bin Laden are now being held in prison in the Cayman Islands.
Now, those 3 men have not been charged with any crimes. They're being held on immigration charges because they were in the Cayman Islands illegally. The United States has investigators in the Cayman Islands that plan to talk to those 3 men. So, again, this was a letter from an anonymous writer. We have spoken, Dateline has spoken to that writer. But again, the government saying this was just speculation, but certainly a curious connection here of the timing of the letter and, of course, the details.
But these circumstances with Middle Eastern suspects being found or witnessed having pilot uniforms in their possession or left over seem to be a constant, as like what ABC's John Miller reported around 7 p.m. on September 14th.
And in New York City today, police are detaining 2 more people that were called in as suspicious by a Manhattan hotel, both Saudi Arabians, both of whom had pilots' uniforms and certificates from a Florida flying school.
Another trail of evidence led to Hamburg, Germany, where Atta and al-Shari once lived. Police have searched apartments, questioned witnesses, and made at least 1 arrest. It's even leading to Italy, where last April 2 American Airlines pilots were robbed of their uniforms, badges, and documents. Police want to see if that is related to this.
In fact, while the dragnet was global, German authorities had searched the previous residence of both Mohammed Atta and Ziad Jarrah, where 2 people were taken into questioning, one a female whose face wasn't visible, and another male who was reported to have been arrested and employed at the airport there. No details were given as to whom, but it was likely one of 2 Atta's Moroccan associates from the Hamburg cell, Ahmad Siddiqui or Saeed Bahiji. It's also interesting that according to a book by Jürgen Roth, described as one of Germany's top investigative reporters, that in February of 2001, Mohammed Atta and two associates, one of them being a Pakistani Air Force pilot, applied a job with Lufthansa Airlines at the Frankfurt Airport in Germany, which would give them access to secure areas of that airport, but apparently none of them are able to get the job. But what also seems to coincide with that is another flight and plausible operative for 9/11 that had also departed Germany through Lufthansa Airlines right before the attacks.
And the Globe and Mail is reporting the RCMP is questioning a man at Pearson Airport in Toronto. The man was one of thousands of passengers headed for the U.S., but rerouted here on Tuesday. He was reportedly carrying a Palestinian Authority travel document, and one strange detail as well, he was also apparently carrying a photo of himself in a flight crew uniform against a fake backdrop of the World Trade Center.
Here at home, meanwhile, the RCMP have confirmed that Immigration Canada officials detained a man who may be connected to the attacks on the U.S. He arrived at Pearson International Airport in Toronto the day the attacks took place on a U.S.-bound flight that was diverted. Police say he had what they describe as, quote, materials of interest, unquote, including photos and a flight jacket. One newspaper report says he carried Palestinian Authority travel papers and a picture of himself in a flight crew uniform against a fake backdrop of the World Trade Center. The RCMP won't confirm those details. They say they've been in touch with the FBI.
It turned out to be a man from Yemen who lived in Detroit, whose full name is Naguib Abdul Jabbar Mohammed Al-Hadi, who was flying from Yemen via Frankfurt, Germany to Chicago on September 11th. But his plane, Lufthansa Flight 430, was diverted to Pearson Airport in Toronto, Canada, following the morning's attacks, as planes became grounded from the FAA's no-fly ban. His baggage was still transported from Germany to Chicago on a different Lufthansa Flight 432, which had departed earlier and was permitted to land in Chicago, which meant that Al-Hadi may have originally been chartered to board that flight and arrive in Chicago at a much earlier time, but may have run into complications with booking his flight or air traffic from Frankfurt. His wife, Renee Applewhite, and 3 children lived in the Detroit area. He was alleged to be in possession of fake passports, a pair of sales uniforms from his job with Lufthansa Airlines, as well as a piece of paper containing cryptic writing, which was said to be determined as a tag from a laundry. Al-Hadi was found to have very suspicious items. Customs officers searched his suitcase and found 4 Yemeni passports, each with a different passport number. One passport had the name and photo of another person. He was arrested and placed in solitary confinement for the next 3 weeks, as his lawyer petitioned to have him released on bail terms. The Washington Times article, Passengers Say Suspicious Flyer Had Partners, September 28, 2001, stated that Al-Hadi was traveling with at least 4 others, and witnesses aboard the aircraft have told the FBI that when the pilot announced that the flight would be forced to land in Toronto because of an unspecified catastrophic event in the United States, Al-Hadi and others apparently traveling with him produced a bottle of wine from the carry-on luggage and shared celebratory sips with each other as they huddled near the mid-cabin restroom. They were very upbeat, said one passenger who sat near 2 of the men in the group. They seemed in a really good mood, which seemed odd under the circumstances. In an article simply titled, "Two Grilled Here, Trade Center Backdrop Used for Photos Taken in Aircrew Uniforms," by Tom Godfrey and George Christopoulos in the Toronto Sun, September 15, 2001, FBI anti-terrorist agents are grilling 2 men arrested here who are suspected of links to the attacks on Washington and New York City. The men, who had pictures of themselves dressed in flight uniforms against fake backdrops of the World Trade Center, were questioned for hours yesterday in a protective wing of the Metro West Detention Center, police said. The first suspect, an unidentified Middle Eastern man in his 20s, was arrested at Pearson Airport on Tuesday as he arrived on a flight that had been diverted from the U.S. He was among 14 travelers on flights diverted from the U.S. who were arrested by police and immigration for a range of offenses, including possessing drugs and phony documents. The person of interest to the RCMP, following the incident in the U.S., said Force spokesman Sergeant Paul Marsh, "This person had photographs that were of interest to us." Marsh refused to disclose the nature of the photographs. Police sources said the man had several photos of himself in flight uniforms against a fake drop of the World Trade Center. He had his thumbs up, and he was smiling, the sources said. He appeared to be having a good time. In a Washington Post article by Keith B. Richburg, October 3, 2001, the United States is seeking extradition of Al-Hadi, 35, and has charged him with 1 count of making false statements in the use and application of a passport and 1 count of fraud to obtain a U.S. visa. Al-Hadi told the judge that he wanted to go home to Yemen. "I need help," Al-Hadi told the judge. speaking in Arabic through a translator, "There is a plot against me. I am a Yemeni national. I wish to be tried in my country." Followed up in explaining his appearance in court, Mustafa Noman, Yemeni's ambassador to Canada, said in an interview that the Yemen government is investigating how al-Hadi obtained multiple passports. Noman said it is illegal in Yemen to have multiple passports with different names and information, and that al-Hadi would face trial for the offenses in Yemen if returned there. Noman said he knows al-Hadi's family very well. It owns airlines, a tourist company, a machinery company, and a high-tech telecommunications company. Noman said al-Hadi was educated in Yemen and worked for Lufthansa as a ticket agent for 5 or 6 years. "I am 100% sure he had nothing to do with the events of September 11th, Noman said. Donovan Vincent, staff reporter for the Toronto Star, in Yemeni Man Tells Court There Is a Plot to Get Him, October 3, 2001, wrote, in rambling comments, delivered at times in English, but mostly through an Arab interpreter, al-Hadi, who is facing U.S. charges relating to the misuse of visa and passport fraud, begged Mr. Justice Brian Tratford for the opportunity to tell his story from the beginning to end. "If I don't make it clear now, I'll be in serious trouble. I'm not like those people you think of," al-Hadi said. He did not elaborate or explain who was behind the plot against him. The article also states, a Lufthansa official told the Star last week that al-Hadi worked as a ticket counter agent for a firm in Yemen that was contracted by the airline. The contract ended in 1998, and the spokesperson for the airline could not explain why al-Hadi would have the uniforms. Jane Gadd, courts reporter for the Globe and Mail, Yemeni man denies link to terrorism, October 3, 2001. Al-Hadi said, "I want to talk. I need help. There's people in a sort of cooking a plot," Mr. Al-Hadi said frantically through an Arabic interpreter. "There are people who are playing both sides, from this side and the other. I have a problem, and if I don't make it clear now, I will be in more serious trouble." Immediately after 9/11 in 2001, Gary Batassar represented Al-Hadi, and in the Canadian press on November 22, 2001, he told Ontario Superior Court Justice Brian Tratford in an angry tirade against the U.S. Department of Justice. Officials south of the border waited until the end of the 60-day period set out in Canada's extradition treaty with the United States to submit his paperwork formalizing the request, Batassar said, basically accusing the American government of deliberately dragging their feet in processing Al-Hadi so that they could hold him longer, followed up with saying, "That conduct does not reflect well on the U.S. justice system." Initially, U.S. authorities believed he was a key figure in the 9/11 attacks. In May 2002, it will be reported that Canada has approved his deportation to the U.S., where he is wanted for several charges of passport forgery. But it appears that in January 2003, he is convicted in the U.S. on forgery charges, but Al-Hadi's whereabouts is unknown. Now, it doesn't exactly seem that Al-Hadi was the type that was supposed to carry out a suicide mission, considering his former occupation and the items found on him. He may have been involved in a support role to give cover to the other operatives that were supposed to conduct hijacking operations from Chicago. That the city itself is one of the major targets underlined in the BOJINKA plot, with it being the home of the largest skyscraper in the United States, the Sears Tower. Chicago itself continues to be a worrisome target for a major attack, as has been reported years later, with other attempts to get at it. Also, amidst the turmoil that day of 9/11, the last passenger phone call from Flight 175 by passenger Peter Hansen to his father indicated that the hijackers were communicating amongst each other, deciphering which target they were supposed to hit, with Hansen saying, "I think they intend to go to Chicago or someplace and fly into a building." It's pretty obvious Sears Tower was a target, but why investigators were certain that Al-Hadi was involved and compelled to slow the judicial process is because of what they discovered searching through his cell phone records. According to the Washington Examiner Weekly Standard editor David Tell in Due Process for Terrorists July 1, 2002, that soon after Al-Hadi's arrest it was revealed that telephone records linked Nabil al-Marab with Al-Hadi, the mysterious Yemeni man who was arrested on September 11th after attempting to fly into Chicago with 3 different passports and a Lufthansa flight uniform in his bags. So who is Nabil al-Marab? Remember when I said that we're not done with Canada yet? I'll let Canada's CBC News give you a bit of an introductory.
A clearer picture is emerging tonight of the man arrested by the FBI last night in Chicago, a man wanted by both Canadian and American authorities. And in this CBC Investigative Unit report, Terry Malewski has more information on other suspects who have authorities concerned. Terry.
Peter, the FBI last night arrested a man called Nabil al-Marab, age 35. CBC News has obtained his immigration file, and it's quite a story. He was born to Syrian parents in Kuwait and was refused refugee status in Canada in 1994. But then he went underground and managed to live and work illegally for 7 years in both Toronto and Boston. Al-Mirab has a Boston cab driver's ID, and he's wanted for an assault in Boston in May of last year. But this June, he was caught hiding in the back of a truck trying to get into the U.S. at Niagara Falls. He was charged in Canada with carrying a false Canadian passport and detained for 2 weeks, but then released.
Al-Mirab was running by the Boston, Massachusetts Police Department.
As the FBI announced Al-Mirab's arrest, those who knew him in Toronto seemed stunned. They said he'd occasionally stayed here at his uncle's apartment in an inner-city Toronto neighborhood and helped out sometimes at this downtown coffee store run by his uncle.
The tenants now are coming to my door today. They're very scared. They think that now is somebody going to retaliate against us building.
Concerning Canadian links and his arrest previously in the month of June that year.
That's tough for us to understand.
The opposition wants to know why he was let loose.
This man was apprehended with a false Canadian passport and false documents. He was turned over to Canadian authorities by the U.S. And what did they do with him? They let him out on bail.
The government said it didn't have enough solid evidence.
We do not detain individuals on whispers or innuendo. We need to have that evidence.
But there was abundant evidence, and it wasn't whispers or innuendo, but documented facts presented by the government itself at the immigration hearing in July when Al-Mirab was released. Here are some of those facts. He'd been ordered out of Canada in 1994, but went underground with fake Canadian ID. He'd crossed the U.S. border back and forth illegally, and he'd been convicted of assault in Boston and was wanted for violating probation. The adjudicator at the hearing said you demonstrated your willingness to use fraudulent documents to elude immigration authorities, both here and at the U.S. border. Then he released Al-Mirab on a $15,000 bond put up by his uncle. That uncle, Ahmad Shahab, is a religious leader who's supposed to be speaking tomorrow at a public meeting on Islam versus terrorism. But there's much more now on Nabil Al-Mirab. Numerous reports in the U.S. say that he was on the FBI's watch list because he was linked with Osama bin Laden's al-Qaeda organization.
Al-Mirab was freed in June of 2001 from Canada despite telling the FBI he had trained on rifles and rocket-propelled grenades at militant camps in Afghanistan, and after admitting he sent money to a former roommate convicted of trying to blow up a hotel in Jordan. Free despite efforts by prosecutors in Detroit and Chicago to indict him on charges that could have kept him in prison for years. Those indictments were rejected by the Justice Department in the name of protecting intelligence. Even 2 judges openly questioned Al-Mirab's terror ties. But Nabil Al-Mirab was arrested on September 18, 2001 in Chicago on a parole violation related to stabbing his Detroit roommate in the knee during an argument on May 30, 2000. He pleaded guilty in December 2000. He is known and has admitted to knowing Khalid Sheikh Mohammed as well as many other operatives of the Millennium Plot. Nabil Al-Mirab moves to Boston in 1989 and apparently lives there as a taxi driver and sleeper agent for already several years before the first attack on the Twin Towers in 1993. In 1992, he learns to use weapons in the Afghan al-Qaeda training camps, becoming a sniper, along with his roommate Raid Hijazi, born in California and is a Jordan descendant, later involved in the Millennium Plot. As many 9/11 hijackers, Al-Mirab went to fight in Chechnya in 1999. He receives 5 driver's licenses over a period of 13 months in addition to carrying driver's licenses from Massachusetts, Illinois, Florida, and Ontario, Canada. All places that he was living at simultaneously. His previous residence, having lived in Florida, also brought to the attention just how central he really was to coordinating the 9/11 attacks, being that most of the hijackers had already resided there, and that he was usually working these cities as a cab driver, just as some of the 1993 World Trade Center bombers were, which also gives access and familiarity with airports. Al-Mirab appears to have moved every few months or continually changed his residence on official documents, at one point listing an address in Dearborn, Michigan that was a truck stop. Incidentally, on September 11, 2000, a year before 9/11, he obtains a Michigan license permitting him to drive semi-trucks containing hazardous and caustic materials, but is still unsuccessful in trying to find a tractor-trailer driving job 1 month before the September 11th attacks. He had also bragged to a Jordanian informant about planning to die as a martyr by driving a gasoline truck into a New York City tunnel, turning it sideways, opening its valves, and having an operative shoot a flare to ignite a massive explosion. Federal investigators had also provably tied al-Marab to 9/11 hijackers Ahmed al-Ghamdi and Satam al-Sakambi. But many eyewitnesses see Marwan al-Shehi and Mohammed Atta at the Toronto copy shop owned by al-Marab's uncle, Ahmed Shahabab, a prominent local imam. Some of the dozens of eyewitness accounts say Atta sporadically worked in the shop at some point. 2 months after 9/11, U.S. and Canadian police determined that there is a flurry of phone calls and financial transactions between al-Marab, Atta, and al-Shehi days before the attacks. Additionally, Canadian authorities will claim that in days before 9/11, al-Marab sends money through a Toronto bank account to at least 3 men who will later be arrested in the U.S. for supporting roles in the 9/11 attacks. The names of the 3 men had not been released. At least $1,500 is sent to one of the men in days before 9/11. A 24-year-old former girlfriend of al-Marab from Boston, who requested anonymity, described him as a slacker with little diversion. She also said that he did not appear religious, quote, never mentioned going to the mosque, never mentioned religion. After his arrest in September, he was kept in solitary confinement for more than 8 months without seeing a judge in his prison sentence. Federal prosecutors lodged a material witness warrant but was dropped, and he was cleared of any terrorist activity or organization connections, but pled guilty to conspiracy to smuggle an alien into the U.S. from Canada and was ordered deported to Syria in January of 2004. But then al-Marab was arrested by Syrian intelligence agents, where it's believed he is still jailed with no reports of being officially charged with any crime. Both Democratic and Republican senators later expressed bafflement and complained about this deportation of an extremely likely 9/11 suspect. Rumors suggest that al-Marab may have been flipped as a U.S. intelligence asset while incarcerated before being deported. All of it extremely troublesome, particularly when it came to Detroit, where one of his addresses raided by law enforcement found 3 suspects, plus 2 more mostly of Moroccan descent, one of them from Algeria, were found with suspicious and incriminating evidence, a lot of it pertaining to black market and ID fraud. One of them, Yusuf Memensa, was already jailed in Iowa. Another had also lived in Minnesota, Abdullah El Mardoudi. Although one of the Moroccans and Algerian were proven innocent of any terrorist affiliations and let go years later, the Detroit sleeper cell is a rather interesting case which viewers would need to take their own time to explore and come to their own conclusion. But interestingly, for all of them roughly being in the same region or vicinity in the country, as well as nationalities and original port of entry, plus one of them already being incarcerated before 9/11, strangely enough, there was no direct link attributed to them or Nabil Marab by way of Zacharias Moussaoui, even though both had already served in Chechnya, and there are numerous other operatives that were 1 to 2 degrees connected. Basically, it wouldn't be a huge leap of speculation to consider that maybe al-Marab was actually the real 9/11 ringleader and not Mohammed Atta, considering that he'd already been residing in the U.S. before the first attack on the Twin Towers in 1993. But both Moussaoui and al-Marab were the first set of material witnesses arrested after 9/11, as well as our unidentified pilot hijacker arrested on September 13th at JFK, suspected of commencing more hijackings there, having a residence in Boston linked to an Osama bin Laden brother, and very likely to also have been one of the suspects attempting to hijack United Flight 23 there on 9/11. But questions need to be asked as to who else was being arrested and originally charged for supporting roles in the 9/11 attacks, like the example made with al-Marab's Toronto bank account links, which is why we should return back to around noon on September 16th during the news timeline, focusing on the amount of material witness arrests and INS detainments to see what else surfaces in the dragnet pertaining to unaccounted for hijacking targets and other efforts to strike the country.
Well, one of the things that struck me about what Ashcroft said today is that there was sort of a tacit admission that the United States does not have a firm handle on the number of terrorist organizations operating within the United States. One official I talked to yesterday said, look, we're not thinking that anything is imminent, but we just don't know.
You mentioned Iraq. Vice President Cheney said on Meet the Press that our information is Iraq was not behind this latest incident. But should a primary goal of the war on terrorism be to topple Saddam Hussein?
Yes, I think so.
We know that one of the persons arrested on a material witness warrant was this pilot that showed up at JFK and LaGuardia and caused, in part, all of the confusion there Thursday night that resulted in shutting down LaGuardia, JFK, and Newark for 3 hours, those 3 airports for many hours on Thursday. He presented a false identification, they believe. When authorities questioned this man, he was considerably less than forthcoming, and they believe he may have additional information.
Intelligence officials and investigators in this country saying that, contrary to some of the earlier reports, there may be as many as 35 continually operating groups at large in the United States. At one point, we were given to understand that there could have been as many as 4 or 5 still remaining as part of what was the coordinated attack on September 11th. They are now saying that there are probably far many more than that. Much of the investigation is focused on Texas, New Jersey, and Florida, where it is said, where investigators believe there are still a number of these groups still at large.
Our chief congressional correspondent, Carl Cameron, who also has been doing a lot of work this weekend on intelligence gathering. Carl, what's the latest?
Well, there's a number of arrests that have occurred overnight in the last 36 hours or so, particularly centralized in New Jersey. Overnight, a number of suspects believed to have ties to Osama bin Laden were arrested, brought into custody in New Jersey. They include 2 men who are from Jersey City. Jersey City specifically important because it is believed by investigators to be the former headquarters of Sheikh Omar Rahman, who in 1995 was convicted for planning attacks on a variety of New York City landmarks. Mr. Rahman, still in custody, however, he has a variety of disciples who are believed to, at this point, be at large around the country. There was a second warrant for material questioning issued overnight, and another man, again from Jersey City, New Jersey, brought into custody. That would bring the total to 3 just in the last 24 hours who were actually brought into custody for additional questioning. U.S. intelligence investigators as well as domestic counterterrorism officials saying all of them are wanted because it is believed that they have specific knowledge about the planning and orchestration of the attacks on the World Trade Center. In addition, on Thursday of last week, 3 men were arrested at Newark, New Jersey airport. They are from Passaic, New Jersey. They are still in custody today. And Fox News has learned, Rita Cosby is reporting, that they had several $1,000s worth of cash on them at the time with one-way tickets to Syria.
But we've been warned. We've been warned there are evil people in this world. We've been warned so vividly. And we'll be alert. Your government is alert. The governors and mayors are alert that evil folks still lurk out there. Yeah.
Mr. President, do you believe Osama bin Laden's denial that he had anything to do with this?
No question, he is the prime suspect. No question about that. Now, this crusade, this war on terrorism, is going to take a while, and the American people must be patient. I'm going to be patient, but I can assure the American people I am determined. I'm not going to be distracted. I will keep my focus to make sure that not only are these brought to justice, but anybody who's been associated will be brought to justice. Those who harbor terrorists will be brought to justice. It is time for us to win the first war of the 21st century decisively.
Back here in the United States, 25 people that we know of have been detained and questioned by the INS in connection with this case. We now know that 2 other people have been arrested on what are called material witness warrants. It means they had to be arrested because the authorities wanted to talk to them. Either they were concerned that they were going to flee or other potential reasons.
And of course, there is some intelligence information to pass on to you, if I could, very briefly. As you know, there have been 6 people detained in New Jersey, 3 from Jersey City and 3 from Passaic. And there is information obtained by Rita Cosby and Carl Cameron, which indicates that some of those people had a lot of money on them and a one-way ticket to Syria. Osama bin Laden, as you know, has denied responsibility. I'll let that go without any other comment. Pakistan is being asked to help. And there is a report from our Carl Cameron that the Mossad has been involved in trying to provide information to the FBI. They may have come here, best information we have, and talked to the FBI recently, 2 senior Israeli intelligence officers, and they told us that there may have been as many as 200 terrorists in the United States. This was last week, remember, and that large-scale operation was apparently being planned. They didn't have any of the firm details, and they said that it would be imminent. If that information turns out to be accurate, that would have been the only early warning that the United States may have reached as far as we know.
Unfortunately, like the similar circumstance with Joe Biden's early appearance on NBC's Today Show, September 14th, on September 16th, Archive.org's Understanding 9/11, a television news archive, for some reason also has a glitch and will not show a couple of hours worth of news video of the timeline with Fox News' Carl Cameron's appearance, first making this report about a warning from Israel's Mossad, as Brian Wilson just reported. But this should come as no surprise at this point with how much Fox News is already covering the dragnet with the material witness arrests from Jersey. Because as we are able to fast forward 3 months later onto December 2001 with Carl Cameron and Brit Hume's infamous 4-part news piece on the Israeli spy ring, which incidentally by that point in December of 2001, 200 Israelis had already been rounded up before and after 9/11 for INS and espionage charges.
Now, among the developments of those we know have been held on these material witness charges, one man at JFK Airport who was part of the reason for that confusion at New York's 3 airports on Thursday, one of 2, and possibly by this hour both men who are on an Amtrak train picked up in Fort Worth, Texas, after they had to get off their plane that originated in Newark on the morning of the suicide flights. At first, authorities thought they were drug couriers, but then it was discovered they were carrying box knives, a large amount of cash, and one official tells us tonight that lead is extremely promising.
Only this morning, the FBI flew a man named Zacharias Moussaoui from Minnesota to New York. His case is being followed today by ABC's Brian Ross.
He was taken into custody August 17th in Minneapolis after his behavior at a Minneapolis flight school raised suspicions. He showed up with thousands of dollars in cash and wanted to learn quickly how to fly a 747 to take flight simulator lessons. And he told the instructors there that he only really cared about flying the plane in a horizontal position. He didn't really care about takeoffs or landings.
Also, in the last 24 hours, a San Antonio doctor was brought to New York for questioning. He's believed to be linked to 2 of the suicide bombers. And 2 men detained Wednesday in Fort Worth, Texas, also brought to New York. They were found carrying box cutters and $20,000 cash on an Amtrak train. In some cases, people detained since Tuesday have already been released. Presumably, some innocent people are being swept up.
Before we move on to September 17th, you may be asking yourself, who are these 2 men picked up in Fort Worth, Texas, found with all the details mentioned, particularly with what Pete Wilson detailed, as we've promised to address Newark Airport in New Jersey, where these 2 Middle Eastern men originated from. The 2 men are Ayub Ali Khan and Mohammed Jawed Azmath, and reports about their arrest first appeared on local Texas news on September 13th, but their story really started to pick up mainstream media coverage until the evening of September 14th and morning of 15th, intensively by NBC News.
Matt, good morning to you. That man arrested when he had false identification in New York. Authorities not satisfied with his answer, so they're holding him as a material witness. But as for what federal officials consider one of their hottest leads, it's the detention of 2 other men stopped on a train. Investigators believe they may have important information about the terrorist support network. Senior officials now say the FBI is very eager to find out exactly what the 2 men were up to when they were detained Wednesday on an Amtrak train in Texas. Authorities say the 2, Ayub Khan and Mohammed Azmath, boarded an airplane in Newark on Tuesday, the day of the suicide plane attacks, bound for San Antonio, getting off the plane when it was grounded by the FAA in St. Louis. They then boarded an Amtrak train but were detained in Texas after getting into an argument during the train ride. Federal agents say the 2 were carrying box-cutting knives, similar to the ones the FBI says were used by the hijackers to intimidate passengers. Investigators have been questioning the men in Texas, saying they've been somewhat cooperative.
Not saying that they weren't cooperative. We talked to them, of course.
But now authorities plan to question them further in New York. And a senior government official tells NBC News he believes they likely have information about the terrorist network responsible for this week's attacks.
2 men were taken into custody at an Amtrak train station in Fort Worth, Texas. The 2 men are proving to be, according to law enforcement sources, quite instrumental to the case. 51-year-old Ayub Ali Khan and another man were on a flight from Newark that was bound for Texas, that along with other flights on Tuesday morning were grounded after the terrorist attacks. Now, the plane was stopped in St. Louis, and from there, he and his associate, 47-year-old Mohammed Jawed Azmath, took an Amtrak train to Fort Worth, where their suspicious behavior, apparently an altercation on the train, triggered authorities to be called in. Now, at the train station in Fort Worth, they were stopped by officers who took them in for questioning for suspicion of drugs. The men had on them approximately $5,000 in their case, and also about a few box cutter knives, similar to the ones used in Tuesday's attack. Now, the men were taken into custody by the INS on immigration violations, but they were also taken up to New York yesterday and are being questioned. They are among 25 people that the INS has detained so far on immigration charges.
Day 5 of the investigation, and federal agents now confirm that at least 25 people are being detained in connection with the attack. Some are being held merely because it appears they're in this country illegally. But others, sources say, are getting a closer look, including the 2 men taken off a train on its way to San Antonio the day after the hijackings. In their possession, investigators say, box cutters, hair dye, thousands in cash, and unused airline tickets. Sources now confirm the 2 have been flown to New York for further questioning. And late today, federal agents raided a Jersey City, New Jersey apartment where it's believed the 2 men once lived.
Other developments today. NBC News learns the FBI raids this Jersey City apartment of 2 men being questioned in New York for a possible connection to the terrorists. Ayub Ali Khan and Mohammed Jawed Azmat were picked up after a bizarre cross-country trip on the day of the bombing. The FBI says the men first boarded a TWA flight in Newark en route San Antonio. The plane was grounded in St. Louis after the attacks. They got on an Amtrak train, acted suspiciously. Their Jersey City apartment in the same neighborhood as Abdul Rahman's, the blind sheikh in jail for life for coordinating the bombing of the World Trade Center 9 years ago.
The men reportedly caused some type of disturbance on the train that caught the attention of passengers and Amtrak officials. When the train stopped in Fort Worth, the men were detained by DEA agents on a routine drug sweep. When Khan and Azmat could not produce passports or proper identification, INS agents booked them into the Tarrant County Jail as illegal aliens in transit. Throughout the morning, FBI task force members and other federal agents were in and out of the Amtrak station in downtown Fort Worth.
What can you tell us about what's going on here at the Amtrak station?
Not a thing. Agents did seize the men's luggage. One was tagged with a TWA baggage claim ticket dated September 11th. Sources have told NBC5 the men were in possession of box cutters and large amounts of cash. There are also reports that one man was wanted on a warrant and the other had an expired visa with a New York City ID card.
But perhaps the biggest break of all were the arrests of these 2 men on a train in Fort Worth the day after the attacks. Police say they were carrying thousands of dollars in cash and box cutters.
Maybe there weren't contingency plans, and they're arguing over what's our next role, where do we go, and they got in a fight over it, and somebody noticed them, and now they're in custody. And that could be a huge break, especially if they cooperate.
Ayub Khan and Mohammed Azmat, both labeled as Indian nationals, were roommates and lied to authorities on numerous accounts of fraud, such as their ages clearly not fitting with their appearance, in what Rita Cosby reported that they were 47 and 51 years old. Khan, whose true name is Gul Mohammad Shah, was 34, and Azmat was actually 30 years old and comes from Pakistani ancestry. He also had a Pakistani wife who was his second cousin that while in custody, he married in a ceremony conducted over the telephone when she was in Karachi, Pakistan. Both Azmat and Khan had fake Indian passports, and according to their landlord, they had been living in 6 Tonell Avenue, Jersey City, apartment 202 for 5 or 6 years. According to the Mirror, on October 25, 2001, their flatmate, Mohammed Pervez, is charged with lying to the FBI about more than 70,000 pounds that moved in and out of his bank. This is nearly $90,000. Pervez used to work in Trenton, New Jersey, where anthrax letters were postmarked. Pervez allegedly made false statements about checks and money orders that were deposited into his bank account and about checks written from that account over the years. A criminal complaint was filed in the U.S. District Court in Manhattan October 16, 2001. Azmat and Khan had a credit card scam running unpaid balances totaling near $500,000, as well as their roommate Mohammed Aslam Pervez, who was a naturalized American from Pakistan and was charged for lying to investigators. According to Dunstan Nickel in the Star-Ledger, December 14, 2001, 2 arrested September 12th charged in credit card scam. Azmat and Khan attracted national attention amid speculation they may have had a role in the September 11th terrorist attacks or in other future terrorist actions. But the complaint unsealed yesterday makes no mention of the attacks. It does say one of the bank accounts used had been opened at the Citibank branch on the Trade Center concourse. The terror case is over and done with. It's fading away, said Lawrence Fatelli, attorney for Khan, and all that's left is the residue of this credit card case. Both men, who immigrated from India, remain in federal custody while officials determine if they were in the country legally. Khan had agreed to be deported to his homeland, but the charge enables prosecutors to keep the two men jailed for up to 30 days, or until a grand jury decides whether or not to indict them. The complaint says Khan's real name is Saeed Gul Mohammed Shah. It also notes both men were interviewed by federal agents and says both changed the accounts of the credit card scheme they had given agents during the first interviews on the topic September 22nd. According to the complaint, Azmoth told agents he was paid $7,000 to $8,000 to sell a third man his Social Security card and New Jersey non-driver's identification card. That man later used a credit card created in the name Azmoth Jaweed to buy Azmoth pants and shoes, and Azmoth knew the third man would not pay the bill, the complaint says. Khan told investigators he sold the man 15 credit cards for between $1,000 to $2,000 apiece. Investigators reported finding 11 different credit cards issued to Azmoth Jaweed and another 20 cards in Khan's name. Together, the cards had unpaid balances totaling $473,000, the complaint states. This should give you a good idea why in some cases it may have not been necessary, even for official hijackers, to find a direct money trail when these sorts of operations and cells can be handled off the book by generating its own income through the underworld of organized crime and black market schemes. But unlike what Andrea Mitchell detailed in her report, and unlike the labels on their bags, Azmoth and Khan did not board a TWA flight at Newark, but instead an American Airlines plane, Flight 1729. This mistake with a TWA flight was also reported by other news sources, including this UK newspaper. However, clearly demonstrating the seriousness of them and their flight being another potential fifth hijacked plane on 9/11, modeled next to the 4 official flights. They purchased one-way tickets, as did all the 9/11 hijackers. One of them purchased their ticket by exchanging another plane ticket that was for September 12th, while also paying for the extra fee for the service of exchange. Their American Airlines Flight 1729 departed out of Newark Airport just 8 minutes after United Airlines Flight 93 did at 8:50 a.m., which as we know was hijacked and crashed in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Again, this could also be another reason for the circumstances with no security CCTV video provided from Newark Airport, as well as what we already suspect with 2 passengers on board Delta 1989 departing out of Boston Logan, in that it's possible that maybe a third hijacker chickened out or wasn't able to make Azmoth and Khan's flight and mission for whatever reason, considering that we know that there's been a suspect pattern in the ratio of 3s, where it's only 3 Middle Eastern suspects who seem to have attempted to hijack United Flight 23 out of JFK Airport, and that with Flight 93 at Newark Airport itself, 5 passenger phone calls that detailed the hijacking scenario being carried out all said that there was only 3 hijackers. According to reports at the time, one of them had a plastic box cutter knife, but it was later claimed to be used in their previous job at a newsstand in Newark's Penn Station. Those early reports detailing box cutters on Azmoth and Khan, as well as a few obscure cases with such items being found on other flights and airports, was all used to harmonize with the details conveyed from Barbara Olson on Flight 77 to her husband, Solicitor General Ted Olson, on the phone, describing a hijacker using a plastic-like knife weapon, sparking the narrative of the box cutter myth being the official weapon in all 4 hijacked flights on 9/11. Aside for the over $5,000 cash found between both of them, even though some early reports stated $20,000, they were also found with a pocket knife and black hair dye. Azmoth carried photocopies of multiple passports depicting him in various guises, with a full beard, a mustache, and clean-shaven, both with and without glasses. There were also receipts for wire transfers, empty cash envelopes with dates written on them, and letters in Arabic. Yet, the report said Azmoth answered no when asked if he was carrying knives or a large amount of money. Azmoth and Khan's bodies were also shaved, which was part of a hijacker ritual detailed in orders loosely associated as Al-Qaeda. According to the Fort Worth police report that most news sources had gotten a hold of then, showed that Khan and Azmoth appeared to be very nervous to questioning officers that Azmoth stated, "I did not have anything to do with New York." It also stated, the carotid pulse on his neck was visibly pulsating rapidly, and Azmoth broke into sweat above his brow, and that Khan was very nervous and evasive when he was questioned about his travel plans. Plus, it also showed how their stories did not corroborate, as Azmoth told officers he was going to see a friend in San Antonio and stay a month, while Khan said they were planning to stay only a week. On September 12th, another Muslim man, Dr. Al-Baydar al-Hazmi from San Antonio, was also arrested at his home by authorities who claimed he knew Azmoth and Khan, or were ready to seek refuge with him. FBI agents searched his house for 6 hours and removed his home computer, medical textbooks, and Islamic magazines, while al-Hazmi called Saudi Aramco, the Saudi Arabian oil company that had sponsored his residency since 1997, and asked them what to do.
Law enforcement officials say a total of 4 people are under arrest as material witnesses in last week's terrorist attacks. Among them, 34-year-old Dr. Al-Badr Al-Zami, a Saudi national arrested at a Texas hospital Friday. A computer and boxes of paper were removed from his home by FBI agents. Attorney General John Ashcroft says all of those being held on immigration charges are being subject to brand new laws about how long they can be detained.
Another part of the investigation leads to a doctor who has worked for years at a hospital in San Antonio, Texas. CBS's Bob McNamara is following the trail there.
Federal sources tell CBS News that 43-year-old Saudi national Dr. Al-Badr Al-Hazmi's credit card may have been used by the terrorists to purchase tickets for flights they would later crash. The day after the terrorist attack, Al-Hazmi's San Antonio house was raided by federal agents, and a computer was among other things seized.
They were just carrying things out, like boxes full of things, and I just noticed that they were carrying stuff out and that I didn't see people that lived there. So I thought that was, strange.
Another computer and records were also seized at the University of Texas Health Science Center, where Al-Hazmi was a resident radiologist who didn't show up for work the day the terrorists struck, and that was unusual.
We did not suspect that this individual had done anything wrong. We're waiting to see if he has. Obviously, we're very concerned.
At home, neighbors say Al-Hazmi and his wife and 2 children kept mostly to themselves.
Everyone would always say hi, but they would never really say hi back.
At the San Antonio mosque that Al-Hazmi attended for several years, he was known to be devout but not fanatical, and was never heard talking politics.
I do not recall him ever mentioning anything about Osama bin Laden. I do not.
Before being arrested, Al-Hazmi had booked a flight last week from San Antonio to San Diego with 4 others on the FBI's so-called watch list. It is unclear whether 2 of the others were Jawed Azmath and Ayub Ali Khan, who were arrested en route to San Antonio with box cutters and $20,000 in cash. Tonight, the people here who thought they knew Al-Hazmi, where he lived, where he worked, and where he worshipped, are stunned. For if he was a radical inclined to terrorism, they never had a clue.
In 1999, Al-Hazmi had twice contacted Abdullah bin Laden, one of the family members of Osama bin Laden, in reference to his nonprofit World Assembly of Muslim Youth, which teaches people about Islam, according to what investigative reporter Craig Palast revealed shortly after the 9/11 attacks, that the address of World Assembly of Muslim Youth, which was in Virginia, was just a couple of blocks down the road where 4 of the hijackers that attacked New York and the Pentagon are listed as having lived. Dr. Al-Badra's travels to Washington and Boston earlier in 2001 was questioned too. Investigators said they were examining whether Al-Hazmi might have been a victim of identity theft after he was released 2 weeks after. According to the book Criminal Investigation by Stephen G. Brandel, it states, it was discovered that 2 of the hijackers used credit cards that belonged to Dr. Al-Badr Al-Hazmi, a radiologist who lived in Texas, for various purchases. It was reported that Al-Hazmi was not seen at work on Tuesday morning 9/11. According to Seattle PI, innocent Muslim doctor tells of arrest 2-week ordeal. On September 30th, 2001, he was released, but ironically denied knowing Khan and Azmath, but went to the same Arizona flight school as hijacker of Flight 77 that struck the Pentagon, Hani Hanjour. And if things couldn't be any more suspicious, this man, Salim Ibrahim Al-Hazmi, a 26-year-old working at a petrochemical plant in Saudi Arabia, was reported as a living hijacker, instead being the Flight 77 hijacker Salim Al-Hazmi, who was 21. Salim Ibrahim Al-Hazmi, whose name matched with the list of suspects, had not visited the United States and claimed his passport had been stolen by a pickpocket 3 years prior. But on September 19, Saudi newspaper Al-Sharq Al-Awsat published Salim Ibrahim Al-Hazmi's photo alongside Badr Al-Hazmi, who they claimed was the actual hijacker who had stolen his identity, when in actuality, Badr was alive, who had already been detained by authorities under suspicion of already being linked to cells. Not too accurate to say the least. On September 19th, Dr. Al-Hazmi, in his 8th day of detention, was finally allowed to meet with his attorney, Jerry Goldstein, the attorney hired by Aramco, the Saudi Arabian oil company sponsoring his medical studies here. But it wasn't until September 23rd that Badr Al-Hazmi got an opportunity to clear his name. He was accompanied by another attorney who had been hired for him by the Saudi Arabian embassy and had also met with the FBI. Within 24 hours after answering their questions, the FBI cleared Dr. Al-Hazmi. and released him on Monday. The next morning, the doctor boarded a flight to San Antonio after almost 2 weeks in custody and went home. When he arrived in San Antonio on Tuesday, September 23rd, Dr. Al-Hazmi had no idea about the media attention that had been focused on him since his detainment. He moved his wife and 3 young children back to Saudi Arabia a few months after his release, then tried to return to San Antonio but was turned away because a student visa had been canceled during his detention. He had to go back to Saudi Arabia and wait while a new visa was issued with the help of Secretary of State Colin Powell. He left Texas for good in late June 2002 after completing his residency and now works as a radiologist in a hospital for employees of the Saudi National Oil Company and their families. And just for the sake of playing devil's advocate, Dr. Al-Hazmi could have very well been innocent, but there being another potential bin Laden family connections is also very telling, or at least worth considering that perhaps like our material witness pilot suspect from JFK Airport, also with a link to a bin Laden relative may very well been intentional or part of the modus operandi in already trying to frame the bin Laden family, therefore by default already implicating Osama bin Laden himself more thoroughly. But initially, with Dr. Al-Hazmi's arrest on September 14th, FBI agents drove him to San Antonio Airport, where he boarded a small aircraft with Khan and Osmoth, accompanied by a U.S. Marshal and an immigration officer that had also picked up Zacharias Moussaoui in Minnesota on the way to New York.
So we do have good news. One man has been arrested. He's considered a material witness, which...
This is one of the guys who was arrested, and they said not right. Important at first.
Arrested Thursday night at JFK. Plus, they have detained 2 guys who kind of hopscotched across the country, wound up down in Texas. According to the Dallas Morning News this morning, they were then whisked to New York City. They're still here in New York City. Also, a 4th man, according to the Dallas News, a resident of San Antonio, has been brought to New York City. So that brings 4, the number detained, as they have just put out a watch list with 100 names of people they want to talk to.
And though Osmoth and Khan were also cleared of involvement in the attacks, prosecutors still charged them with unrelated case of fraud involving several hundred thousands of dollars of unpaid credit card charges. The men made a plea bargain, as arguing for their innocence would have left them in jail much longer than confessing their guilt. They had agreed afterward to be deported for immigration violations in February of 2003, after both men spent 16 months in prison, with the first 12 months of detention in solitary confinement. Dan Egan and Bob Woodward were awarded the 2002 Pulitzer Prize for National Reporting for their September 29 article in the Washington Post about the detention of Khan and Osmoth, and which mentions an anonymous source said that both men had flight training, a major detail which was mostly held from the mainstream press, that basically they were trained as pilots. After returning to India, both Osmoth and Khan faced new problems. Authorities there detained and questioned both of them. The Hyderabad authorities criminally charged Khan and Osmoth with passport fraud, and as of June 2005, were still routinely interviewed and homes were inspected. A book had been released in 2001 called Detained Without Cause: Muslim Stories of Detention and Deportation in America After 9/11 by Irum Sheikh, presents narratives of known Muslim or Arab profiles detained on links to terrorism charges. The first chapter covers Osmoth. Throughout the entire chapter on Osmoth, nothing is detailed about what he and Khan were charged for in their credit card scams, as well as no mention whatsoever about their roommate, Muhammad Pervez. He essentially changed his story for the book, claiming that they were attempting to move to Texas to start new lives. In fact, the book primarily documents unfair conditions Osmoth felt he was being treated at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, and how the FBI also tried to plea bargain with him to admit to being a part of the 9/11 attacks, which sounds as if they wanted to make him a material witness against whoever could confess to who orchestrated it or neutralize him and flip him over as an asset. In the book, he also made accusations that the feds fabricated evidence. He also said he had no idea who the blind Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman or anything about the 93 bombing conspirators, nor about their mosque that was in the same neighborhood, even though Osmoth said he attended a different mosque and first moved in the U.S. in 1991. But in regards to his terrorism research, yet he had this to say: I don't think that Muslims even carried out the attacks, because Islam does not allow the killing of innocent people. There is a possibility that some Americans did it. When the Oklahoma bombing happened, they arrested many Muslims in that area. Later they found out that Timothy McVeigh did it. I believe that someone else did the attacks, and the U.S. government is using Muslims for political purposes. Osmoth later appeared in a video 3 years later after the book to do a sit-down interview with Indian news website twocircles.net. where the questions were mostly asked in English and Azmath only responded in Arabic, even seeming to struggle with some answers, never looking at the camera. Alleging ill treatment also drew instant controversial media attention of whether torture should be practiced and effective for the United States. On October 21, 2001, Washington Post article hinting at the U.S. government's use, rendition, and torture, silence of 4 terror probe suspects poses dilemma for FBI. It refers to 4 suspects, which seems to be 4 essential material witnesses, and out of the hundreds arrested in the U.S., that material witnesses Zacharias Moussaoui, Nabil al-Marab, Ayub Ali Khan, and Mohammed Azmath may actually have links to al-Qaeda. According to the detention of Ayub Ali Khan and Mohammed Jawed Azmath Wikipedia page under detention, investigators said they offered Azmath, Khan, Zacharias Moussaoui, and Nabil Marab the prospect of reduced sentences, money, jobs, and new identities within the U.S. if they assisted investigation into the attacks, while threatening to inject them with a truth serum, identified as sodium pentothal, or to transfer them to countries with more brutal interrogation techniques. But so far where we've left off, it's only been on the evening of September 16th, and Nabil al-Marab isn't apprehended until September 18th. But let's move on to the morning of September 17th in continuing to follow our 4 material witnesses that we have so far in hopes of uncovering what happened to our Saudi suspect pilot from JFK Airport and Flight 23.
Meanwhile, some sobering news from Justice Department spokeswoman Mindy Tucker, who tells reporters that the #1 goal for law enforcement officials this week is to apprehend individuals believed to still be at large in the United States who are suspected of having been involved in Tuesday's attack, including a man who's already been arrested at John F. Kennedy Airport who was found to have a phony pilot's license, and 2 men detained in Texas who have since been transferred to New York who were discovered with large sums of cash, box cutters, and other items that suggest not only were they involved in Tuesday's attack, but may have been planning further attacks on the United States. Law enforcement authorities telling ABC News that they believe that in addition to those individuals who have since been apprehended, there are suspected individuals still at large in the United States.
The number of people in custody under sealed material witness warrants has climbed to 4, and sources say more may soon be arrested as well. Federal authorities caution, however, that they are not certain any of these people may actually be charged with Tuesday's attack. Some, it appears, are simply being detained because they could only be held for 72 hours under immigration law, and agents wanted to question them further. The real manhunt is on for what is described as a handful of colleagues of the hijackers who also have pilot training. Officials say there is clear and credible evidence that that small cell is still in the United States, and therefore they consider the level of a threat for another attack to be high. Finding those individuals is our #1 priority, said one official. To that end, they have asked for the records from all 1,600 of the nation's flight training schools. In addition, another 155 individuals are on a red alert watch list distributed to all law enforcement agencies and civilian airlines. Some of these people, we are told, had tickets to fly on September 11th and did not show up.
Several people are being held for questioning in connection with last week's terrorist attacks on the U.S. A man with a fake pilot's license arrested at JFK Airport in New York is now being questioned, and a man who was detained at Toronto's Pearson Airport after the attacks has been handed over to the FBI. NBC News reports the FBI is also focusing on 2 men who were taken off an Amtrak train in Texas the day after the attacks. Investigators say the men were on a flight from Newark Airport in the morning of the attacks.
Now, in terms of the investigation itself, the Justice Department is now expanding the number of people that are being held on what are called material witness warrants. Now, we're going to be hearing a lot about this term in the coming days. It allows federal authorities to hold someone in custody. It's a court order, and it allows interrogators to continue to question people, and generally it's used for people that the FBI believes have information that could be helpful to the investigation, but that letting them go or just stay home might cause them to flee. So the number of people in this category is already up to about half a dozen and probably will rise today and continue to rise in the coming days. There's a separate category of people who are being held by the Immigration Service. As the FBI questions people who might have any knowledge about this, they discover that their visas are expired or they have other reasons to hold them. And there's at least 24 people in that category.
But we're going to smoke them out. And we're adjusting our thinking to the new type of enemy. These are terrorists that have no borders. There's an old poster out west, as I recall, that said, "Wanted, dead or alive."
Dan, this morning the Justice Department raised to 175 the number of people whose names have been entered into police computers, airline, all border, and INS checkpoints. These are people that the FBI wants to talk to right now in the most serious tones that you can imagine. They have questions for them about their recent travel. They have questions about their associations. But thus far we have only 3 people, I believe, now under material witness warrants, and these people may or may not end up being charged. Dan, in short, I sense that they have now gone through a vast wealth of leads in this case, but are settling in for the long haul. I don't look for any criminal charges in the immediate future, Dan.
We have, in the course of questioning a number of individuals throughout the country, we have 49 individuals who are currently being detained by the Immigration Service because of some concerns about the status of those individuals in the country.
Director, how many people have you arrested on material witness warrants or otherwise?
I cannot and will not give you the total numbers on material witness warrants. It suffices to say that there are a number of material witness warrants that have been issued. They are sealed in most cases, and I cannot give you direct numbers. Yes, sir.
Director, why can't you give us direct numbers?
Under seal. A number of the warrants are under seal. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Can you at least characterize their level of cooperation at this point? The people that you've detained and also the people who are in INS custody. If you're talking to them and if they've been providing valuable information.
Well, it's hard to generalize. There are individuals cooperating, yes. There are a number of individuals that are not cooperating.
With the FBI additionally sealing off how many material witnesses they have arrested or held, now disables any other efforts for reporters to follow up on what exactly happened to our JFK pilot, with an address linked to an Osama bin Laden brother in Boston, as the probable suspect in the attempt to hijack Flight 23. And since we are now at the final day of Understanding 9/11, a television news archive near 1 p.m., no other network news carries on further detailing any of the material witnesses or INS suspects detained. Only but commentary from Dan Abrams of MSNBC, with his in-studio experts giving their best assumption how the investigation of 9/11 is being handled with the dragnet detainment of unspecified suspects.
The Attorney General and the Director of the FBI also giving us some numbers as to the progress of that investigation. Let's take a look. They say they've had 47,000 tips on their website, 7,800 from their phone calls to the hotline, 26,000 tips have been developed by the FBI field office, 49 people detained by the INS, and at least 2 as material witnesses. Now, I say at least 2 because right now they're saying they are not going to disclose how many people have been arrested under what are called material witness arrest warrants. We do know that 2 people had been arrested using a material arrest warrant as the reason. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. And this may be the most important part so far. 49 people have been detained in connection with the case by the INS. Now, we don't know exactly how many have been arrested, but we do know that at least 2 are being held as material witnesses, meaning they were arrested and are being questioned or are going to be questioned by the FBI and others. And so I want to talk about what this means, what they can get, what they're hoping to get from these people. Lise Wheel joins us now from Seattle. She's a former federal prosecutor and law professor at the University of Washington. And from Los Angeles, Rick Hahn is a former FBI supervisor and terrorism expert. Lise, you get someone in there. I mean, you've dealt with terrorism cases, too. You get someone in there who's a material witness. And I think some people are going to say, look, if this is someone who knows something or may have been involved in some way, you're dealing with people who are willing to kill themselves. How are they going to be able to actually get information from these people?
Well, what they've got to try to do is say, look, this is your time to talk now, because others are talking and giving things up, as we heard today the FBI director saying that some were cooperating. So it's time to say to these material witnesses, this is your chance to cooperate now and get out of this, or you're going to be sitting in a jail forever. But that's right, they are martyrs, or suspected anyway of being martyrs, and it's going to be very difficult to wear that hard glove and actually get something from them.
Well, hi there, Lester. We know that 49 people are in detention, being detained by the INS, in addition to at least 2 who have been arrested on what are called material witness warrants. We don't know how many more. Both the FBI and the Justice Department not wanting to be that specific about numbers with regard to arrests. The president saying that we are going to have to smoke these people out here in the country. How can that be done? They're already here.
Well, you're absolutely right. Several of them are here. However, the investigation as it's going along is obviously getting some cooperation from some of these people that are in custody. And through that cooperation and through telephone records, credit card records, banking records, I think we're identifying, the FBI is identifying potential co-conspirators, and in so doing, I think we'll continue to see more and more people going into custody and more material witnesses or material witness warrants issued.
And that's pretty much it when it comes to Understanding 9/11, a television news archive, archive.org, as the collection is only labeled as being between September 11th and 17th, 2001. It's also the end for us in at least attempting to trail the suspects from JFK and LaGuardia Airport on September 13th, as clearly they've done everything they can to silence those attempts, at least with the last count of material witnesses from what we know separate from the minimum of CBS's Jim Stewart, is only 4. But this is not the end of what we need to examine in at least confirming other targeted flights for hijackings on September 11th or 13th, in that these arrests are under the presumption of such. And this is actually not the end of Understanding 9/11, a television news archive, as when you change the last 2 digits on the web address to 18, an extra day appears on news archives that are blank, except until you click on some.
Here are some other headlines. A Pakistani delegation has left Afghanistan, no agreement on turning over Osama bin Laden. Here in the U.S., 4 people are being believed held as material witnesses in the FBI investigation. 200 others are being sought now.
Dan, the United States has received intelligence reports indicating that Mohammed Atta, the pilot of the first plane to crash into the World Trade Center towers, met early this year somewhere in Europe with the head of the Iraqi intelligence service. Intelligence officials say they believe this report to be accurate. They say this is not a smoking gun, but it is the first indicator, obviously, that a foreign power may have aided, abetted, or had prior knowledge to Tuesday's attack. Mohammed Atta, by the way, is believed to have been the cell leader of the 19 individuals responsible for Tuesday's attack, but officials say they have no firm, concrete evidence of that yet.
It seems that being exactly 8 days after 9/11, CBS's Jim Stewart is the first to report the eventual disputed Iraq link to Mohammed Atta, with the intelligence officials that Stewart details in his report as being believable and accurate, actually turns out to be Israeli intelligence, the Mossad. Because even though this report on Atta is still days before any case of anthrax letters are mailed off and eventually received the following month in October 2001, essentially those early stages with the anthrax attack investigations are also used to harmonize and suggest that the alleged meeting in Prague between Atta and head of Iraqi intelligence was for the exchange of the anthrax, which subsequently is proven to have come from U.S. AMRID in Dietrich, Maryland. Although this report is eventually repeated with some detail, CBS won't be the only one picking up this story, but the report on the last count believed of 4 material witnesses arrested, as well as 49 detained, will also be a constant.
Now for the latest on the people suspected of carrying out these attacks. U.S. investigators are holding 49 people for questioning in connection with immigration violations. As many as 200 people are being sought. In New Jersey, the FBI is focusing on a neighborhood in Jersey City where Muslims convicted in the 1993 World Trade Center bombing lived.
The FBI has taken a San Antonio, Texas doctor to New York for questioning. Dallas Morning News reports there is an apparent link between the doctor and 2 men removed from an Amtrak train in Fort Worth, Texas, last week. Texas newspapers report that the 2 men were suspected hijackers.
While the investigation is ongoing and still moving forward vigorously, we are beginning to learn more about the attack last Tuesday and the plot to make it happen. As we have said before, we do believe that there are associates of the hijackers that have connections to terrorist organizations that may still be in the United States. The tips we have received and the leads developed in the FBI field offices have been extremely helpful in helping us assemble a list of individuals that might have information about these associates or, in fact, be among the associates. We are looking at the possibility that there may have been more than 4 planes targeted for hijacking, but we are not able at this time to confirm that.
Well, now it seems that John Ashcroft and the FBI are momentarily willing to admit that they believe there were more hijacking targets intended on September 11th, and with the material witness warrants being sealed, the media does not hesitate to report this revelation. But of course, the claim that there were additional targeted flights does not become part of the official story, which we will address further ahead.
Also, Attorney General John Ashcroft is confirming reports that more than 4 planes were targeted in the terror attacks. The investigation in this case continues to gain momentum, including more arrests.
Pat, U.S. officials say a total of 75 people are now in custody, mostly for immigration violations. Attorney General John Ashcroft says 190 people are still being sought for questioning. Law enforcement officials say a total of 4 people are under arrest as material witnesses in last week's terrorist attacks. Among them, 34-year-old Dr. Al-Badr Al-Zami, a Saudi national arrested at a Texas hospital Friday. A computer and boxes of paper were removed from his home by FBI agents. Attorney General John Ashcroft says all of those being held on immigration charges are being subject to brand new laws about how long they can be detained.
At this hour, 200 people are wanted for questioning in the terrorist attacks. That number doubled since yesterday. And we're beginning to learn more about the plot, surrounding Tuesday's hijackings. Fox 5's Paul Wagner has been tracking the investigation for us. He joins us live from our newsroom. Paul?
Well, Mike, earlier today, just about an hour ago, Attorney General John Ashcroft said they're looking now into the possibility that more planes were hijacked. I should say more planes were targeted for hijacking, but the FBI cannot confirm that at this point. In addition, the Attorney General said they would like to talk to as many people as they can who may have answers to their questions.
Our effort includes talking to the numbers of people that may have information related to the case. That's why we have forwarded a list of more than 190 people to national, state, and local law enforcement agencies across the country and other organizations that could be helpful in this effort, organizations like the airlines.
Attorney General John Ashcroft says more than 4 jetliners may have been targeted in last week's attack.
The nation's top law enforcement officer announced several more steps that authorities are taking to crack down on foreign nationals whose immigration status is in question. Gary Reels has more details now from our satellite center.
JC, Ashcroft says the fight against terrorism has become the overriding priority of the Justice Department since last week. He is establishing an anti-terrorism task force in every one of the 50 states, and he's also trying to find out just how many airplanes were intended to take part in last week's attack. Since the suicide hijackers crashed into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, there has been much speculation that the White House, the Capitol, Air Force One, and Camp David were alternative or additional targets. But now, the Attorney General says more than 4 jetliners may have been part of the plot for September 11th. If the plan did include other aircraft, that means, of course, there are other would-be hijackers still out there. Since the attack, 75 foreign nationals have been detained for questioning. More than 190 others are being sought as the search for associates continues.
Investigators sent the airlines and authorities a list of 200 people they want to question. They also confirmed they're looking into the possibility the terrorists intended to hijack more than 4 planes.
A week after the terrorist attacks that shook the nation and the world, President Bush led the White House staff in a moment of silence for the dead, the wounded, and grieving. As they paused, federal authorities sent the airlines and state and local authorities a list of 200 names, individuals they want to question, and they confirm they are investigating whether terrorists planned to hijack a 5th plane in Tuesday's attacks.
We have not ruled that out in our evaluation, and we are pursuing an examination and investigative potentials that might help us be more certain.
As the search for other terrorists proceeds, the Immigration and Naturalization Service was given special controversial authority. It will let them hold aliens indefinitely in special circumstances.
Investigators say there's a possibility more than 4 planes were targeted in the initial attack. And at a briefing today, U.S. Attorney General John Ashcroft said nationwide task forces have been set up to look for associates of the hijackers that may still be in the country.
Task forces will be a part of a national network that will coordinate the dissemination of information and the development of a strategy to disrupt, dismantle, and punish terrorist organizations throughout the country.
75 people have been detained for questioning, 4 arrested as material witnesses in the terrorist investigation.
The number of missing continues to climb up in New York City, and so does the number of arrests. 4 people have been arrested in connection to these attacks. 75 people have been detained. We've also learned tonight that more than 4 attacks may have been planned last Tuesday. Well, tonight authorities have raised to 200 the number of names on a watch list of people that they want to question in connection with Tuesday's terrorist attacks.
We begin with the investigation. There is new information tonight about ties the terrorists had to our local area and possibly to leaders in Iraq. Jackie Benson is here now with more on that. Jackie?
Well, Jim, U.S. officials tell NBC News that Mohammed Atta, the hijacker who flew American Airlines Flight 11 into the World Trade Center, met with Iraqi intelligence officials in Europe earlier this year. U.S. officials characterized the meeting as another lead to pursue. But they say it is not sufficient evidence to formally link Iraq's leader Saddam Hussein to the attacks. And there is official confirmation this afternoon that investigators believe the terrorist plan was not limited to 4 planes. Attorney General John Ashcroft publicly confirmed for the first time that FBI agents are investigating a chilling scenario, that the plot for last Tuesday's attacks was even more extensive. In New York, 4 people are under arrest as material witnesses in last week's terrorist attacks. Officials now say a total of 75 people are in custody, mostly on immigration charges, and they are subject to a new INS regulation that went into effect last night.
A federal grand jury in New York has opened an investigation into the attacks on the World Trade Center. Also, Attorney General John Ashcroft says more than 4 aircraft may have been part of last week's plot. And for the first time, there are indications, still unconfirmed, that a foreign government may have been involved. Gary Reels in the Satellite Center with the latest. Gary, what do you know?
Well, Gordon, for the past week now, most fingers have been pointing, of course, to Osama bin Laden. But tonight, Iraq also is coming under U.S. government scrutiny. CBS News reports one of the 19 hijackers had a meeting with a top government official in Baghdad.
Mohammed Atta was one of the hijackers on American Flight 11 out of Boston. It was the first jetliner to crash into the World Trade Center last Tuesday. Tonight, CBS News reports Atta met earlier this year in Europe with the chief of Saddam Hussein's intelligence apparatus. The subject of the meeting with the Iraqi is unknown, but it is the first time a foreign government official has been connected to any of the 19 hijackers. At his press briefing today, Defense Secretary Rumsfeld paused long when asked about the report.
What I have said, as clearly as I know how, is that states are supporting these people. And what constitutes evidence and who wants to present it at what time, I'll leave to the people in that business. I'm in a different business.
At the Justice Department, however, they're not talking about Saddam Hussein.
I wouldn't be in a position to discuss evidence in regard to questions about other responsible parties.
Ashcroft does say that the September 11th plot may not have been fully executed.
We learn something, often something small or incremental, every hour. Today, the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, Bob Graham of Florida, said that the attacks last Tuesday were part of a larger plan. And the Attorney General said today there was a possibility that terrorists planned to hijack more than 4 planes last Tuesday.
And interesting enough, in reference to who Peter Jennings mentioned, Bob Graham, because one of the main senators that backed the initiative to release the 28 pages missing from the Joint House Inquiry Investigation, also known as the JIS report, that Graham still maintains till this day in the belief that there were more hijacking attempts intended on 9/11.
Peter, people at the FBI say their massive investigation has developed substantial leads, including a suspect list of some 190 people, 37 of them flight trained. FBI agents are investigating whether there were other terrorists with other plans on that day a week ago.
We are looking at the possibility that there may have been more than 4 planes targeted for hijacking.
For example, the investigation has led the FBI to issue a warning to the pilots of crop dusters to be on the lookout for suspicious activity. And no such planes are allowed near the country's 30 largest cities. Out of apparent fear, a chemical attack of some kind could be launched. Law enforcement authorities in a number of states also have been told that a possible terrorist strike might be carried out using a fire truck or ambulance loaded with explosives.
And it's important to note here, with all the hysteria and state of alert going on at this moment after 9/11, still proceeds with many warning signs and threat assessments for potential targets that ranged outside the modus operandi of hijacking passenger airliners. And what was also detailed here by Brian Ross about fire trucks or ambulances loaded with explosives, potentially being car bombs, is extremely important, as also very telling indeed with the authorities handling the crisis, mainly their sloppiness and cover-ups, with what's later concerned about the graphic news coverage and explosive accounts regarding the destruction of the Twin Towers, even though the intention of this film is not to get into any of the physical anomalies about the World Trade Center. But on the official scale, being that 9/11 is basically the largest international terrorist attack anywhere, as said to have been carried out by Al-Qaeda under the behest of Osama bin Laden, yet all the previous terrorist attacks attributed to the loose organization, including what's argumentative regarding the first attack with the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, plus the attacks that have happened since 9/11, have all been events that have used explosives or bombs. Yet, since Wednesday, September 12th, as some of the mainstream news networks already had on their architect and physics experts to relieve and bring closure to the public, and that the buildings came down from the subsequent fires, and that no explosives were in the Twin Towers, therefore no reason for the American public to panic or be alarmed for any other types of impending terrorist attacks, other than what was seen with the airplane hijackings. But here we are, 8 days later, and the authorities are warning the public that yes, there could be more terrorists out to use explosives. I mean, shouldn't there also be something said about the FBI titling the 9/11 investigation as Pent Bomb, Twin Bomb?
The FBI has now detained 75 people in the investigation of the attacks. Attorney General John Ashcroft said today that there's a possibility more than 4 planes were targeted for hijacking. CBS News correspondent Jim Stewart in Washington has new information this evening about the hijackers. Jim?
Dan, U.S. officials have received a report that at least one of the dead hijackers met before the attacks with an Iraqi intelligence officer. They believe the report to be accurate. Officials say Mohammed Atta, the pilot of the first plane to crash into the World Trade Towers, met early this year in Europe with the head of Saddam Hussein's European intelligence service. The meeting is not a smoking gun, officials say, but it is the first indication that a foreign state may have aided or at least had some knowledge of last Tuesday's attack.
But there's also something to be said with the rush to judgment in already trying to implicate Iraq this early in the investigation, with so much questioning regarding reprisal attacks and just the extent with the range of hijacking targets really intended on the day of 9/11, and as even with September 13th, which has really been the premise for this film, because such a wide-scale operation as what the news reports are alluding to would seem beyond the range of state sponsorship or organization through Iraq and Saddam.
Meanwhile, the number of potential suspects involved in the attacks now being held under sealed material witness warrants is believed to stand at 4, while the number of people placed on a national watch list grows almost hourly.
There it is. That's as far as we can go down the news timeline regarding the immediate dragnet with the 9/11 investigation, pertaining to additional thwarted or aborted hijacking attempts, as well as potential terrorist activities. We may have not been able to identify our suspect from JFK Airport from September 13th and suspected on Flight 23 on 9/11, but we've certainly collected enough details to know when and how the story got buried. And from what we've entirely covered so far, the question should be asked, is this enough reason to believe that the 9/11 attacks were just a continuation or expansion of the original BOJINKA plot? The answer is yes. The plans that were discovered on Ramzi Yousef's laptop from the apartment fire in Manila seem to have been broken down into 3 phases, with part of it incorporating an assassination on the Pope while visiting the Philippines. The later phase being that 12 planes would be hijacked and crashed rather than just bombed as initially planned. 7 of the flights would be departures from Asia, while the other 5 flights would be departures from Honolulu, LAX, San Francisco, Chicago O'Hare, and JFK in New York. The targets would have been the World Trade Center, Pentagon, U.S. Capitol, the White House, Sears Tower in Chicago, the U.S. Bank Tower in L.A., the Transamerica Pyramid Building in San Francisco, as well as other targets. Nuclear power facilities are often mentioned. In 2009, Mike Williams of 9/11 Myths released partly declassified documents titled 9/11 Commission Files Team 7 Box 7 Other Flights 9/11, which is 39 pages that mostly contains transcript articles from September and October 2001, like some of the ones we've demonstrated earlier regarding accounts of aborted hijacking attempts, included with notes taken from FBI field agents and in correspondence to 9/11 commissioners. But on page 5 there is a chart titled Suspect Aircraft of September 11, 2001, which labels 11 commercial airlines flights included with the 4 official 9/11 flights, also labeled as the original route for each flight, as well as where it was forced to land, with each airport abbreviated in flight code. Also charted is the status of the flight and abbreviations for communication centers who reported on the few flight incidents. However, there are 2 of the flights that have no indication of where its departure and destination is at, only where it was grounded. Aside for the 4 official flights, the flight that's charted on the 6th row is clearly identified as Delta 1989, which departed Logan, as we've covered in this film earlier. But the other 6 flights do not seem recognizable. The first is American Airlines Flight 2247, which departed out of MCO, which is Orlando International Airport, and destined for SHV, which is Shreveport Regional Airport, Louisiana, but was grounded at Memphis International Airport. According to another document, United FAA Command Center chronology of the events of September 11, 2001, uploaded by 9/11 Document Archive in 2009 on Scribd, says that at 10:04 a.m., ZFW, which stands for FAA's Fort Worth Center, reported this American Airlines Flight 2247 to the command center was Nordo, meaning radio contact with it had been lost, but the communication was restored by 10:17 a.m. The second plane on the suspect aircraft of September 11, 2001 chart is U.S. Airways Flight 41, departed CLT, which is Charlotte Douglas International Airport in North Carolina, with destination being LAX, as were most of the official 9/11 flights. The U.S. Airways flight was also grounded at Memphis Airport. No further details are given about this flight. Skipping the 5 recognizable flights, charted in the 8th slot is the third plane, Northwest Airlines Flight 197, that departed LAN, Capital Regional International Airport, formerly Lansing Capital City Airport in DeWitt Township, Michigan. Its destination was Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport in Marquetta, Minnesota, but grounded at Sawyer International Airport, Michigan. According to the United FAA Command Center chronology of events of September 11, 2001 document, the command center appeared to have been alerted to this plane while en route at 10:03 a.m. Document states anonymous call to Northwest Airlines Flight 197 by Lansing Flight Service Station. Reason for the report is unknown. The fourth plane is United Airlines Flight 641. Departure and destination unknown as the field is blank, but it also states that it was grounded at Detroit Metropolitan Airport. But being that most of these flights were routine flights, it turns out that United Airlines Flight 641 has appeared in the press, even before 9/11 in 1996, regarding an incident where it departed Newark and 16 of their passengers, who were Japanese tourists, fell sick from seafood they had eaten on the flight and were taken to a Chicago area airport where they landed, which their destination was O'Hare Airport. And in 2002, the Morning Call article on September 12th talks about an account with 34 passengers on board United Airlines Flight 641 departing on the 1-year anniversary of 9/11, around the same time frame as Flight 93 did from the same airport, Newark, which interviews an elderly female passenger overcoming her fears being on that flight, where yet again its destination being Chicago O'Hare. So clearly, although United Airlines 641's route isn't charted for the list of the 11 suspect aircraft of September 11, 2001, it was either at one of 2 places on the day of 9/11 from where it departed, which was either Chicago O'Hare or Newark. Already both airports were inferring has additional hijacking attempted activity unaccounted for. But according to United FAA Command Center chronology of events of September 11, 2001 document, United Airlines lost contact with the plane around 10:40 a.m., but persistent attempts to communicate with it were eventually successful 5 minutes later. The fifth plane, United Airlines Flight 57, with its departure and destination also unknown, with a blank field, was grounded at GCK, Garden City Regional Airport, Garden City, Kansas. It appears to have been reported to the command center by controllers at Denver International Airport, for reasons that are unknown. But according to the Garden City Telegram, September 12, 2001, day after 9/11, from the front page article titled "Students Get History Lesson" by staff writer Brian Snow, reporting about United Flight 57, having landed at Garden City, interviewed some of the passengers that the flight had departed Washington, D.C., and the destination was Los Angeles, likely LAX, again with the same pattern with most 9/11 flights. Although having departed from D.C., it's also likely to have left from Reagan National Airport rather than outside in D.C. and Virginia, at Dulles Airport. But it did depart around the same time the plane that struck the Pentagon, Flight 77, did at 8:10 a.m. The Garden City Airport, which was small and not equipped to service large airliners, had the passengers remain on board for more than an hour, as police and fire department showed up at the scene to raise their ladder from their truck to unload passengers. The only other interesting details noted in the article is that all the passengers had to get screened due to where the plane had departed, and that 4 of the passengers were Secret Service agents that needed to return to D.C. immediately due to the attacks. The 6th plane was another U.S. Airways Flight 633, which departed Philadelphia International Airport, with a destination unknown, but according to United FAA Command Center chronology of events of September 11, 2001 document, it says it was headed for Las Vegas, but it was grounded and returned back to Philadelphia International Airport, and at 10:55 a.m., controllers at Philadelphia International Airport reported they had lost the flight. The Command Center chronology indicated the plane subsequently landed in Philadelphia at 11:14 a.m. This chart is 1 plane shy from a dozen to fit with the BOJINKA plan, but aside for Delta 1989, the other 2 Logan flights that were reported and mentioned earlier are not listed, though the transcripts of the articles are contained within the 9/11 Commission files Team 7 Box 7, other Flights 9/11 documents. And of course, Flight 23 from neither JFK nor Osmoth and Khan's American Airlines 729 from Newark are listed on the chart of suspect aircraft of September 11, 2001. Nor is one designated for September 13th, which are likely for reasons you can decide, but also contained are sloppy notes taken from field agents detailing the incidents that are clearly both Flights 23 at JFK and Osmoth and Khan's flight. But there are other additional news articles out there suggesting that more flights were targeted, like what was reported in Chicago Tribune about American Airlines Flight 160 out of San Diego Airport that was destined for JFK Airport on 9/11. With a departure time unknown, the flight was canceled, and there were no suspects, but only weapons were found on the flight. According to the blog Shoestring 9/11, in their post titled "The Many False Hijackings of 9/11, which elaborates many more additional accounts that viewers would need to cross-examine further before considering each claim as a seriously potential extra hijack, but it is a decent source of extra articles and documents aforementioned. But it states that more than 20 aircraft were identified as possible hijackings, and even ranges as far as 29. 20-plus targeted flights does seem conceivable at this point, especially with the news reports we've already encountered that authorities already had a list of almost 200 suspects they were looking for, with 37 of them potentially trained as pilots. In fact, in 2015, the Austrian documentary A Good American, which chronicles the work of former NSA official and whistleblower William Benny in his work with building Thin Thread, also developed by agent Edward Loomis, that analyzed intercepted data covertly obtained from communications of suspected terrorist networks, which might have been able to prevent the 9/11 hijackings. But Thin Thread was thwarted in August of 2001, just 3 weeks before 9/11, by high officials within the agency, mainly Agency Director General Michael Hayden, whose decisions left the NSA without a system to analyze the trillions of bits of foreign intelligence gathering by intercept of signals flowing over the internet, as Thin Thread was able to do, which was a far less expensive system, but ended up being shelved in favor of Trailblazer as an alternative, which cost millions and was intrusive and lacked privacy safeguards and also less effective. Feeling that the NSA was nefarious or mainly at fault in no detection of early warning signs in allowing the 9/11 attacks to happen, William Benny, Edward Loomis, and another NSA agent resigned a month after 9/11 at the end of October, Halloween. But the documentary also notes what took place not long after in 2002.
After 9/11 and after we left, Tom took over running Thin Thread. And he said, well, let's take the software in Thin Thread and run it against the database that we've accumulated inside NSA to find out if there's any information that the 9/11 attack that we should have known about, but didn't.
We let it run. It was somewhere around 24 to 36 hours. I remember my program manager coming back with the initial results, and they were just devastating. We discovered critical intelligence, Al-Qaeda and associated movement intelligence that had never been discovered by NSA. They didn't even know they had it in their databases. But also the specific details of numbers and movement and times and locations, travel. And you're seeing the dispersal patterns that occurred after it happened. You're also seeing that there was parts of the plot in which they weren't successful. There was multiple planes that had been targeted. And for a number of reasons, those particular planes were not actually hijacked. You can imagine the horror of realizing what had not been discovered and the confirmation of what was known, sitting in these databases. What if this was discovered prior to 9/11? We had the information in the databases.
Obviously, the claims made in this Benny documentary in regards to what was discovered within the NSA's aborted Thin Thread program after 9/11 only supports our film in that the 9/11 attacks was supposed to be a maximized version of the BOJINKA plot, continental as a Trojan horse, as it vindicates exactly what all these news reports and stories we've laid out taking place right after September 11th, which were incrementally buried throughout the mainstream media and local press. But before we come to a closing and addressing the additional arrests and what it all essentially means with the end result of the 9/11 Commission report, there's still one other news archive source that we can sometimes rely on, and that's C-SPAN. So if we return back to September 18th during Ashcroft's daily briefing at the FBI, where 75 people were already detained on immigration charges, as well as the 4 material witnesses, plus the 200 suspects authorities are reportedly looking for, a reporter also asked Ashcroft in reference to all those suspects detained within the first week, wanting to know if they were going to be considered enemy combatants, which would therefore allow investigative authorities to hold these suspects indefinitely.
Suspects be considered prisoners of war? Are you assuming wartime powers in any way?
Ashcroft answered with a flat out,
no.
Thank you.
But there's a lot to unpack here, considering what sort of ideal investigation most Americans wanted and expected after 9/11. Regardless of how enraged or ill-informed most of us were in the beginning, seeking revenge and full of bloodlust in that Operation Enduring Freedom, going after the Taliban and bombing Afghanistan, seemed justified. But yet there were also follow-up attempts of hijackings and other attacks in small portions that continued onward after 9/11 in the following month and year, that also fell in sync with the constant state of fear and federal terror threat assessments, often later discarded as false alarms. Some of them having to do with anthrax letters, which was also allocated as a different law enforcement matter and case, which is a subject that could be made into a film by itself, as it has yet been in books and literature. But some of these detainee suspects were even American-born citizens and had lived in the U.S. prior, just like John Walker Lind, captured as an enemy combatant during Operation Enduring Freedom in the invasion of Afghanistan in November of 2001, but no link or association to the 9/11 attacks was ever proven. Then there's Jose Padilla, born in Brooklyn, who was arrested at Chicago O'Hare Airport coming from Pakistan in May 2002 and was plotting to set off a dirty bomb in Chicago. Neither him was ever combined or charged in the 9/11 conspiracy, even though the September 11th attacks were something clearly planned years in advance. Not even Anwar al-Awlaki, born in New Mexico of Yemeni ancestry, who was seen here just days after 9/11, interviewed in a report in Virginia on hate crimes and vandalism carried out at the mosque he held sermons at. He was never picked up or detained, when years later it's revealed he had numerous Al-Qaeda links, and even associated with 2 of the hijackers of Flight 77, the plane that struck the Pentagon, both in San Diego and Virginia. Instead, he's eventually killed in a drone strike by the Obama administration 10 years later in 2011. The bottom line is that no American citizen was ever charged in being involved in the 9/11 plot. But considering what suspects do get filtered in the immediate FBI dragnet, or ultimately charged for masterminding and aiding the 9/11 conspiracy, is mainly Zacarias Moussaoui, who was already arrested in August 2001 for INS charges in Minnesota, and is now serving time at Supermax Prison, Colorado, with other past Al-Qaeda conspirators. But separate from Moussaoui, those as 9/11 conspirators later caught overseas end up mainly being held in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, where some of them go through torturous interrogations, like waterboarding, packaged to the public as enhanced interrogation techniques. And questions remain still if those controversial techniques were necessary, or effective at all, and for what purposes. And then there's the question if some of the Gitmo detainees were even guilty at all of any wrongdoing pertaining to 9/11, since there are a few cases where some have been released, including others held in secret detention facilities overseas, often called CIA black sites. Not to mention the slow and agonizing process it's taken to charge some of these Gitmo detainees, who very well may be guilty, but as Human Rights Watch focuses on their conditions, it also brings to attention that some of the detainees' tribunals have yet to take place. And then there's also the unresolved matter or questions regarding how the German government handled all the Hamburg cell and associates, being that they are labeled as the official ringleaders of the 9/11 conspiracy. Why are some of the Hamburg members free or never charged of anything to do with 9/11? And why no suspects were handed over to American authorities and Gitmo or other detention centers? But in regards to whether George W. Bush was considering anyone held within the Pent Bomb investigation INS detainees as prisoners of war, therefore using wartime powers which would have enabled federal agents to conduct a thorough investigation, having these suspects held indefinitely rather than under limitations of immigration and naturalization laws, should be a major signal now when looking at it through Ashcroft, in that the Bush administration was not serious about investigating the 9/11 attacks at all, but instead were illegitimately focused on Iraq, even though most Americans would have been okay with enhanced interrogations being used on these immediate detainees, so long as it was publicly clear that they were suspects and it was an overwhelming number. It means that most of the public would not have immediately objected to such torture techniques on abundant, relevant suspects, rather than wait years later to be used on a few questionable Gitmo detainees during an already now era of great mistrust and skepticism over the attacks. Because with the Pent Bomb dragnet and INS detainees first apprehended to have been 9/11 suspects, the number reached up to 700 to 1,200 detainees, depending on which source. Some have said as wide as a range of 2,000 detainees, but that ultimately many of them were freed because of initially being picked up under false profiling by authorities as either foreigners or Muslims. Attorney and author Steve Brill, in his book, After, The Rebuilding and Defending of America in the September 12th Era, notes, the Bush administration knew that the attacks had come from Muslims, so without any better leads, why not just question any such men you could, and hold those who it turned out were violating the terms of their visas? Had they taken jobs? Had they overstayed their visas? They would then be detained for immigration violation and questioned repeatedly. It didn't matter if the violations were minor transgressions for which immigrants of other nationalities are rarely, if ever, held. The goal, Ashcroft and Chertoff told the FBI and INS agents, was to prevent more attacks, not prosecute anyone, and the best way to do that with the roundup, question, and hold as many people as possible. Referring back to the book Detained Without Cause, Muslim Stories of Detention and Deportation in America After 9/11 by Irum Sheikh. In the introduction, Patterns of Post-9/11 Detentions, that does give a decent formal breakdown pertaining to the immediate scale with the dragnet for her subjects in her book. It says, the term 9/11 detentions refers to cases of individuals from predominantly Muslim countries who were arrested after 9/11 on suspicion of terrorism, but were held under unrelated immigration or criminal charges. Immigration officers categorize these individuals as special interest cases because of their suspected involvement with the 9/11 attacks. The total number of 9/11 detentions is unknown because of the secrecy surrounding these cases. But 2 months after the attacks occurred, government officials acknowledged that 1,182 individuals had been detained for questioning. Later, the government stopped releasing the total number of detentions because of the complications in counting, even though detentions of the individuals and connection with the 9/11 attacks continued after the release of the initial figure. The Office of Inspector General, OIG, report defines 911 detainees as aliens held on immigration violations in connections with the investigation of September 11th attacks. Of the roughly 1,200 aforementioned cases, the report focuses on 762 individuals arrested for immigration violations between September 11, 2001 and August 6, 2002. And following that, under 9/11 detainees' demographics, the OIG report provides a demographic breakdown of the 762 special interest cases, including in its analysis, most of the individuals are from predominantly Muslim countries, such as Pakistan, Egypt, Turkey, Jordan, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Tanzania, Syria, Lebanon, Iran, Algeria, Bangladesh, and Afghanistan. The demographic breakdown also identified British and French citizens, most of whom were naturalized citizens originally from countries such as Pakistan, Egypt, and Algeria. The Human Rights Watch report presents a similar demographic breakdown, which showed that most of the special interest cases came from Pakistan, Egypt, and Turkey. 33% of the 762 individuals were Pakistani. This is an interesting revelation, being that the 9/11 attacks are mainly thought of harmoniously as a Saudi conspiracy, with bin Laden a Saudi citizen, and that 15 of the 19 hijackers were also Saudis. But as known with some cases of Pakistani intelligence funding, the Khalid Sheikh Mohammed family lineage, as well as what we've pointed out, there's good reason to suspect aborted Pakistani operatives, as we should also be reminded with the cases before 9/11, such as Nayaz Khan, who was a Pakistani hijacking operative that turned himself in to the FBI in 2000, claiming that he was supposed to be involved in a future terrorist attack mission. Some early newspaper reports in November were also giving a number under nationalities, and some were not avoiding the number of Israeli detainees either. And from the U.S. Department of Justice, Office of Inspector General, OIG, in a 239-page document called A Review of Treatment of Aliens Held on Immigration Charges in Connection with the Investigation of September 11th Attacks from 2003, its chart confirms this high percentage of Pakistanis, while also reveals the percentage of other nationalities. But take notice that the nationalities coming out of India, Yemen, Jordan, Turkey were all greater numbers than those who were detained as Saudi nationals. Yet Egyptians were second greatest number of suspects, nearly quadrupled the amount of Saudis, which shouldn't be surprising being that the predominant number of conspirators charged in the first attack on the Twin Towers during the 1993 World Trade Center bombing were from Egypt, which is another good reason why the first attack on the Twin Towers needs further exploring, which you can see in one of my recent films, World Trade Center bombing of 1993, Hidden Path to 9/11, Crimes, Cover-Ups, and Missing Links. For those who have been in denial of 9/11 being a grand conspiracy with hundreds to 1,000 people involved, regardless if truth seekers' only pursuit is all the speculations regarding what entirely brought down the Twin Towers, still, there you have it, within just the number within the OIG list as an argument and foundation to start with. And as just mentioned, included in the OIG report are some Israeli nationals. However, it does not list the reported over 200 Israelis that were detained and let go before September 11, 2001. This is why it's even crucial for 9/11 truth seekers still looking at only Israeli involvement and foreknowledge cannot ignore or absolve any of the suspected Arab or fundamentalist involvement, which are also areas easier to prove state sponsorship. And regardless of what raw or incomplete chain of evidence lacking from all the officials, there is no need to tolerate substitution for such obvious hijacker roles by fantastical and empty claims as direct orchestration or collusion with the U.S. military and government. With Fox News' Carl Cameron, who does report about the Israeli spy ring in December of 2001, ranging as high as 200 suspects arrested before and after 9/11, is a vindication by controversy to look at, but is an angle that's a limited scope. And also consider months later, in 2002, what is still continually reported after, underlining the operations as art students, likely all living near the hijacker or terrorist cells throughout major cities. It is a damning enough public indictment that they could have alerted authorities and prevented the attacks, but it seems, as many can speculate, wasn't within these Israelis' conscience or modus operandi. But without having to know the total OIG arrest statistics, those within the camp of Israeli suspicions and accusations know that there was a huge number of arrests given some kind of diplomatic immunity with Israelis being detained, which was a great difference of treatment compared to those foreigners labeled as Arab Muslims or other, as the Israelis were only held up to 60 days, 2 months at the Metropolitan Detention Center before being deported. And chronologically speaking, also consider the timing of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed's first public interview along with Ramzi bin al-Shibh for Yossi Fruda of Al Jazeera being in April 2002. This is when KSM decided to take credit for the attacks, having already been filtered to an official scale of 4 hijacked planes and 19 hijackers. KSM never stated that he was the head of the Al-Qaeda military committee, and yet with all the controversial circumstances to how many times he had been waterboarded, tortured, and inconsistencies to crimes he's allegedly confessed to, along with what has been made public from it, KSM's alleged confessions are basically there to reaffirm the official scale of the commission report, and that they were only capable of hijacking 4 planes, and that there was no use of explosives, neither within the hijacking takeover, even though passenger calls made from 2 of the flights stated the contrary, that the hijackers did have bombs. The basic confession of KSM is that 9/11 was simply inspired by the BOJINKA plot, and that they can only manage 4 hijackings is simply laughable on its face, not just because of what we've entirely laid out through this film, but because when the BOJINKA plot was discovered in Manila in 1995, it was clear to Philippines Police Colonel Rodolfo Mendoza, who looked through all the evidence and interrogated Abdul Hakim Murad, associate of Ramzi Youssef, that there was already pilots training in the U.S. for the plan, aside from what other suspects were also rounded up in the Philippines still and in preceding years. But separate from questioning what was really planned, in what could be considered the buildup of 9/11 with the Millennium Plot during the 2000 New Year's Day celebration, the other reason why it's a naive idea to think that 9/11 was simply BOJINKA inspired, limited to 4 planes, is also the case of the 2006 transatlantic aircraft plot, where terrorists planned to detonate liquid explosives carried on board 10 airliners traveling from the UK to the US and Canada, disguised as soft drinks. The plot was discovered by British police during an extensive surveillance operation. So it would be absurd to think that they were only capable of coordinating a dozen planes years before and after 9/11 2001, rather than just in 2001. Not to mention that with the transatlantic plot, it also reaffirms that there was a central higher command than KSM and family already in prison. But coming back to the INS OIG list, it was reported in the New Jersey Law Journal June 9, 2003, under Attorney General's detention policy hindered anti-terror investigations, mass arrest on spurious charges threw a wrench in the works, OIG concludes. Not only does the article detail that Michael Chertoff and the Justice Department lawyers realized that the wide scope of detecting and detaining suspected terrorists in a policy called Hold Until Cleared was wasting resources and tying up FBI and INS agents' hands, and that a note for the FBI was written by the Justice Department stated that the Bureau should know that the policy isn't getting the job done. It was obvious that the overwhelming majority of those being arrested had no connection to terrorism, the article states. Toward the end of the year, the FBI largely abandoned its investigation of the detainees as agents pursued more promising leads or were reassigned. The special interest process, as the detentions were called, came into a grinding halt by November, according to the INS lawyer who spoke to the OIG. At this time, most of the general public and media were focused on Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan, but this New Jersey Law Journal article is a prime example how other news and media sources, amongst their civil liberty advocate spokesmen and organizations, as well as anti-interventionist activists, were in effect sympathetic to the Justice Department and those all detained who they thought were innocent. This type of hostility persisted and was mainly shared towards the Patriot Act taking place. It essentially turned the INS detentions into another crisis, where some politicians took it as an opportunity for publicity by getting involved with some personal cases of detention, showing their own posture of retaliation toward law enforcement authorities and the overall Bush administration. But that doesn't mean there weren't real issues or harsh treatment at the Metro Detention Center, with police officer abuse and profiling either. But in the long run, all this outcry only served to help the Bush administration continue to cover up 9/11, while drawing out early war plans for Iraq, if such an agenda wasn't already planned by the administration when Bush took office 8 months earlier. But the outpouring of concern for those detained only served to distract, as those who may have felt justified countering against the Patriot Act, Homeland Security, TSA, and other government encroachments were still not taking serious and inconsiderate to real threats at what the amount of arrest indicated in implication, that such a high number of detainment was showing a much more wide-scale, insidious grand conspiracy, ultimately meaning that it couldn't have included Saddam and Iraq as conspirators with Saudi state links, nor was it an operation small enough to solely just be under the behest of Osama bin Laden either. And with the pent bomb dragnet, there were huge roundups with airport employees, not just within the 3 airports where the 4 official flights departed, but in other areas such as what we've covered in this film, where employees of Middle Eastern background or foreigners were either arrested, lost their jobs, or were deported, likely in some circumstances of nefarious activity having to do with the pent bomb investigation. But more commonly publicized in these airport busts were accounts of fraud, lying during employment application screening, as well as not having legal residency in the United States. And there very well may have been some cases between the scale of 700 to 1,200 arrested and detained that could have been innocent in hindsight, but the dragnet result of the amount in arrests wasn't an overreaction or entirely ill-founded on law enforcement's part, considering what was all reported from airports. But there's something to be said if detentions came to a halt by November, which would ultimately mean so did the dragnet investigation. Therefore, considering the Bush administration's continued actions overseas at this time, the 9/11 investigation ended then, therefore is incomplete. Most 9/11 skeptics are those who consider themselves as being part of the 9/11 truth community, have been put on a path to take issue only with the 9/11 Commission report. But the reality is, the 9/11 Commission report is actually the third government investigation. Those from the same camp but more rationale also like to take issue with the declassified 28 pages that were released in 2016 and assert that it's redacted evidence from the Commission report proving Saudi state sponsorship involvement in the September 11th attacks. Although the Commission report did not exonerate Saudi Arabia from complicity, the declassified 28 pages are not a product from the 9/11 commissioners, but are actually a result of a much earlier effort called the Joint Inquiry into Intelligence Committee Activities before and after the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, also known as the Joint House Inquiry or JIS report. It was conducted by the Senate Select Committee and House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, basically being the second government investigation, which began on February 2002 and released in December 2002. Which is why the underlining point we are trying to bring across in this film is an understanding that the first government investigation into 9/11, the FBI's Pent Bomb Dragnet, is literally an unfinished, incomplete investigation, and in retrospect, with that state of uncertainty refined by the mainstream media concealing follow-up reports in an effort to reduce any public hysteria, likely under orders of national security, has still been the official premise or base of all preceding official and public investigations. Basically, from what we've covered in this film that does not examine the World Trade Center or Ground Zero, but is centered around the airports on September 11th and after, should be no surprise that the 9/11 Commission report is chock full of omissions. So looking back tangibly at FBI agents scoured throughout the US and overseas in the Pent Bomb Dragnet, it was as if every field office was entirely occupied in the investigation, as there were 7,000 agents on the investigation, with 4,000 of them being field agents, the rest usually administrative, who all worked tirelessly and continuously long hours and consecutive days and months on end. Of course, the government eventually expanded the FBI into a larger bureau that now employs 30,000 agents, but we all know they're never going to be reassigned to open or re-explore the 9/11 investigation, and it would be useless to demand a new government investigation, as every committee or law firm is just going to revert to the first unfinished investigation, separate from the wishes of truth seekers who only want to focus on the World Trade Center and Ground Zero. In constructive terms of an ideal 9/11 investigation, given if more FBI and police documents were made available on 9/11 hijackers and any of the foreign or those labeled as Muslim suspects detained in the Pent Bomb Dragnet, are there 7,000 concerned citizens willing to volunteer their time, skills, and expertises, even going the lengths of filing Freedom of Information Act requests, sifting through raw data such as arrest reports, puzzling to make a case proving the official 9/11 conspiracy is grossly inaccurate and false? Is there an organization big enough to manage that? And what transpiring goals would those concerned citizens like to see occur or change within foreign policy? Part of the purpose of this film is to give viewers and truth seekers a pair of new lenses to look at 9/11 in a much clearer and bigger view that has exploratory opportunity by understanding what's missing, that is not being addressed by the dominant truth movement organizations and groups. Considering the accusations of Saudi sponsorship, if this was presented in the terms of official 9/11 narrative only to target the audience of those defenders, how receptive would they be? And what would be the normal reaction to the information presented within this film just within the scope of additional hijacking attempts on September 11th and 13th? Is this information valuable to 9/11 victims' families or those within 9/11 Families United for Justice Against Terrorism that are clients of Motley Rice, the law firm using JASTA, Justice Against Sponsorship of Terrorism Act, to only sue Saudi Arabia and its royal family? What about law firm Cozen O'Connor, who is also suing Saudi Arabia for corporations and estates that lost businesses and other assets due to the 9/11 attacks, which is also being headed by attorney Sean Carter, who has visited and interviewed Zacharias Moussaoui, in which Moussaoui's testimony in recent years, explicitly naming off Saudi officials as 9/11 conspirators, is being used as evidence in Carter's lawsuit. Are Saudi implications all that should be extracted from Moussaoui? Or is there clearly a wider story he could reveal? Particularly in his legal defense for not having been a September 11th conspirator, he has said that he was only supposed to be in a follow-up attack afterwards. And lastly, what about what's left with the 9/11 truth movement and those expectations from activists seeking transparency and an anti-interventionist foreign policy as a result of uncovering fuller criminality and misdeeds within the Pent Bomb investigation? Clearly, architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth won't dare do such an investigation, as they are categorically a limited hangout that will not even confirm the authenticity of hijacked Flights 11 and 175 striking the Twin Towers, which then leaves Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry Incorporated, headed by attorney David R. Meiswinkle, as the only other alternative option that's voluntarily staffed with about a dozen attorneys and so-called experts. Aside their main focus and initiative with Ground Zero, LC for 9/11 say they are open to investigating other states that had involvement, meaning just with where the 4 official planes departed from. But can they handle all the major cities with these additional aborted cases we've covered in this film, as well as exploring the results from the immediate dragnet? Do they even care about being this thorough? Can LC for 9/11 get off the fence with their entertaining denials of Flights 77 and 93 crashing into the Pentagon and Shanksville, Pennsylvania? Can they manage staffing 7,000 volunteers? The answer is likely no. I'm just one guy. I certainly can't do it all. Not even when it comes to explaining this on film, as I don't have the budget or access to a wider variety of television news archives. And I'm not proclaiming to have 9/11 solved, or that I have all the answers, or that I'm an expert. I just know from my experiences having been a 9/11 truth activist to independent researcher and skeptic that these areas regarding September 11th and the following days after need to be explored by concerned citizens and serious truth seekers, and they clearly have not. But please share this film wherever you can and show your support by subscribing to my channels, and please also consider becoming one of my Patreons. I'm Nelson, aka DJ Thermal Detonator. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Those of you on the left side of the aircraft can see the site quite well. I'm sorry to you folks on the right, but you must take your seats and fasten your seatbelts.